My name is Scarlett, and I am 26 years old. When I was 17, my parents forced me to sleep on a military cot in an unheated garage through the freezing Massachusetts winters. While my older sister Harper had a king-sized bed and a climate-controlled room, my father told me I was the tough one who did not need comfort. For 4 years, I lived on concrete. Then one morning, the city sent a code inspector to check a hissing gas line. He stepped into our garage, shined his heavy flashlight past the meter, and stopped dead. The beam hit my high school chemistry book, my illegal space heater, and my shivering body. He did not say a word to me. He just turned around, walked straight out into the snow, and made a phone call that would shatter my family forever. Before I tell you who was on the other end of that line, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. But only if this story speaks to you. Drop a comment and tell me how old you are right now. I want to know who is listening. Now let me take you back 48 hours before that inspector arrived to a brutal nor'easter storm on the Cape Ann coast and the night I realized my mother wanted me to freeze. The wind off the Atlantic did not just blow. It battered the aluminum siding of our split-level house like a physical fist. Saltwater rain turned into sleet, whipping against the unsealed garage doors. It was January. The temperature hovered near single digits. I sat on my canvas cot wrapped in 2 thin polyester throws I had bought from a thrift store. My breath plumed in the dark air. The draft coming under the rolling door stung my ankles. I needed to block the gap. My fingers were numb, stiff, and clumsy as I fumbled for a flashlight. I crept toward the back wall where Richard, my father, kept his tools and storage bins. There was a heavy plastic trunk in the corner secured with a cheap padlock. I figured there might be some old drop cloths or painting rags inside. Something thick enough to stop the coastal wind from pouring over the concrete. I grabbed a flathead screwdriver from the workbench, wedged it under the lock mechanism, and forced it upward. The metal snapped with a sharp crack. I pushed the lid back. The smell of cedar and lavender hit my face. There were no greasy rags inside. Folded, neatly wrapped in protective plastic, were 3 pristine, heavy wool blankets. Pendleton, the kind that trap heat and weigh you down in a warm cocoon. They still had the tags on them. My mother Diana had bought them at a department store in Boston. She packed them away out here in the freezing dark rather than put them on my bed. I stared at the tags. My vision blurred. She had walked past me shivering in my winter coat to hide these in a locked box, to harden me, to make sure the cold dug into my bones. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered against the floor, spinning away. I did not take a deep breath. I did not stand tall and tell myself I was a survivor. I lost my mind. I grabbed a heavy plastic bucket of driveway salt melt and kicked it as hard as I could. The plastic shattered. Coarse blue salt exploded across the floor like shrapnel. A sharp pain ripped through my foot. My big toenail split down the middle, soaking my sock in blood. I collapsed onto the freezing concrete, curling my knees to my chest. I screamed into the darkness, a loud, ugly sound that the howling wind swallowed whole. I pounded my fists against the abrasive floor until my knuckles scraped raw. I was not tough. I was 17, hungry, freezing, and hated by the people sitting 30 feet away in a heated living room. I laid there on the salt-covered ground, listening to the ice hit the garage door. The pain in my foot throbbed in time with my racing heart. I eventually dragged myself back to the cot, wrapping the stolen wool blankets around my shaking shoulders. The warmth felt like a betrayal. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the rusted pipes running along the joists. I did not know it yet, but those aging pipes were about to fail, and the leak they produced would force the outside world to finally look inside. The morning after the storm brought a bitter, blinding sunlight that reflected off the fresh snow and pierced through the frosted garage windows. I woke up with my heart pounding, a steady ache throbbing in my split toenail. The stolen wool blankets had kept hypothermia at bay, but the air in the garage was still thin and punishing. Every breath I took felt like inhaling crushed glass. I pushed myself off the military cot, my joints stiff and protesting, and wrapped one of the blankets tightly around my shoulders. I needed to use the bathroom inside the main house. I unlocked the heavy fire door that separated my concrete cell from the kitchen and stepped over the threshold. The contrast hit me instantly. The house was a staggering 72 degrees. The air smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon toast. It was an entirely different world, a sanctuary designed for people who mattered. I walked quietly toward the hallway, but the sound of a drill stopped me. My father Richard stood on a step stool in the living room wearing a thick knit sweater. He was installing a state-of-the-art HEPA filtration system onto the ceiling vent. The machine hummed with a low, expensive purr designed to scrub the indoor air of dust pollen and microscopic dampness. Sprawled on the velvet sofa reading a magazine was my sister Harper. She was 20 years old, but my parents treated her like a fragile glass doll that might shatter if the wind blew too hard. Harper had tried attending a local liberal arts college the previous fall, but she dropped out after a single semester. She told our parents the dorm air quality made her too anxious and triggered her asthma, so she came right back home. My parents rewarded her failure by surrendering the master bedroom to her, claiming she needed the attached bathroom for her breathing treatments. I stood in the doorway watching the scene. My winter coat was still damp from the snow that blew into the garage overnight. Before I could take another step, my mother Diana marched out of the kitchen holding a damp cloth. She pointed it at me like a weapon. "Scarlett, you cannot stand there in that wet jacket." Diana snapped her voice sharp and tight. "You are bringing the coastal dampness right into the living room. You know her lungs cannot handle the mildew. Take it off and go back out." I looked at Harper. She did not even glance up from her magazine. She just turned the page, her face a portrait of serene entitlement. She accepted the warm, pristine environment and the lion's share of our parents' resources as her basic birthright. She was not overtly cruel to me. She simply practiced a comfortable, willful ignorance of my suffering, which made her deeply complicit in the toxic structure of our household. Richard climbed down from the step stool, ignoring the tension in the room. He actively enabled my mother's abuse because avoiding conflict at home was his top priority. He wiped his hands on his jeans and pointed toward the kitchen door. "Put your boots back on, Scarlett," he ordered. "The city plows are going to be coming through our neighborhood soon. If they push that heavy coastal snow up against the end of the driveway, we will never get the cars out. Clear your own path before the city traps you." He handed me a heavy metal snow shovel. He did not ask if I was warm enough. He did not ask about the limp in my step from my broken toe. He just wanted the driveway cleared so the neighbors would not judge his property. I walked back out into the freezing morning. Coastal New England winters bring a specific kind of snow. It is not light and fluffy. It is wet, dense, and mixed with ocean salt. It clings to the pavement like cement. I started at the top of the driveway, plunging the metal blade into the slush and lifting. My shoulders burned. My lower back tightened in protest. The wind whipped right off the Atlantic Ocean, biting at my exposed cheeks. I shoveled for an hour, sweating under my damp coat, while the freezing air froze the moisture on my eyelashes. I reached the side of the house where the driveway narrowed near the garbage bins. I paused to catch my breath, leaning heavily against the wooden handle of the shovel. The house was silent from the outside. I looked up toward the second story. That was when I saw it. Harper's bedroom window was pushed open about 2 inches. The screen had been removed. A thin, steady stream of gray smoke was escaping from the dark crack billowing out into the crisp winter air. A moment later, pale fingers emerged holding a lit cigarette. Harper tapped the ash against the vinyl siding, letting the embers fall into the snowbank below. I stood frozen, clutching the shovel. My chest tightened until I could hardly breathe. The severe chronic asthma, the fragile health that forced her to drop out of college, the medical condition that dictated my banishment to an unheated garage with a concrete floor. It was a prop. It was an excuse she actively, intentionally agitated for fun when our parents were not looking. She was poisoning her own lungs while I was freezing to death to protect them. Let me ask you a question. If you caught the golden child destroying the exact excuse used to exile you from your own home, would you expose them? Or would you keep quiet knowing your parents would never believe you anyway? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear what you would do. I did not march inside and drag my parents up the stairs to confront her. I knew the rules of our house. Diana would claim I was lying out of jealousy. Richard would punish me for starting a fight. I had no voice in that house. But the rage burning inside my chest demanded an outlet. I walked to the side door near the patio, where Harper occasionally snuck out to sit on the back steps. Her heavy wool peacoat was hanging on a peg just inside the mudroom. I quietly opened the door and slid my hand into her deep pockets. My fingers brushed against a cold metal rectangle. I pulled out a heavy silver Zippo lighter. It was a petty, useless reaction. I knew that even as I did it, but I closed my fist around the lighter and walked down to the end of our driveway where the street met the curb. There was a heavy iron municipal storm drain partially covered in ice. I stood over the grate looking down into the dark, freezing water rushing below the street. I dropped the silver lighter through the iron bars. I heard it clink against the concrete pipe and splash into the icy runoff washing away toward the ocean. It changed nothing about my situation. It did not make the garage any warmer. It did not expose her lies to my parents. It was a juvenile act of vandalism that left me feeling hollow the moment I let go. But as I watched the snow continue to fall, I promised myself I would stop waiting for my parents to see the truth. I was going to have to survive them on my own. I finished shoveling the heavy snow, dragging my aching body back into the garage as the sun began to set. The temperature plummeted rapidly, dropping back down into the teens. I sat on my cot, pulling the stolen blankets up to my chin. I stared at the ceiling, dreading another long night in the dark. But as the hours ticked by and the neighborhood grew quiet, the air inside the garage began to change. It started subtle, a faint, foul scent lingering near the exposed wooden joists above my head. By 3 a.m, the smell grew thick and heavy. It smelled exactly like rotten eggs. And hidden somewhere in the dark shadows above my cot, a faint hissing sound began to echo through the freezing room. The hissing sound was not loud. It was a persistent mechanical whisper, barely audible over the coastal wind rattling the garage door. I woke up just past 3 a.m, shivering beneath the heavy wool blankets. The cold usually woke me up, but tonight my body felt strangely heavy. A dull, throbbing headache pulsed behind my eyes. I sat up on the cot, pulling the blanket tightly around my shoulders, and took a deep breath. The air caught in my throat. The scent of rotten eggs hung thick and stagnant in the freezing garage. It burned the back of my nasal passages. Growing up in a coastal Massachusetts town, you learn early on what that smell means. The municipal utility companies pump a chemical odorant into natural gas, specifically so homeowners can detect a leak before a spark turns their house into kindling. I threw the blanket off and stood on the icy concrete. Panic spiked through my chest. I looked up at the ceiling. A network of old, exposed iron pipes ran along the wooden joists, delivering gas from the street meter to the main house furnace. Those pipes had been installed decades ago, and years of brutal, humid salt air blowing in from the Atlantic Ocean had corroded the joints. The hissing sound was coming from a rusted fitting directly above the small illegal space heater my parents allowed me to keep plugged in. I stared at the glowing orange coils of the heater. If a pocket of gas built up and reached those hot coils, the resulting explosion would blow the aluminum siding right off the foundation. I stumbled toward the heavy fire door that separated the garage from the kitchen. My hands shook as I grabbed the knob. I threw my weight against the door and stumbled into the warm, dark house. I ran straight down the carpeted hallway toward the master bedroom. I did not care about the rules. I did not care that I was tracking dampness into their pristine house. I pounded my fists against the heavy oak door. "Dad, wake up!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "There is a leak! Dad, wake up!" I heard the bed springs groan. A moment later, the door swung open. Richard stood there wearing plaid flannel pajama bottoms, his hair rumpled. His eyes narrowed, adjusting to the dim hallway light. He did not look alarmed. He looked profoundly annoyed. "What are you screaming about, Scarlett?" he demanded, keeping his voice low. "You are going to wake your sister up. You know she needs her rest. There is gas leaking in the garage." I told him, my words tumbling out fast and desperate. "It smells terrible. I can hear the pipe hissing. We need to call the utility company right now." Richard sighed, a long, weary sound that told me exactly how much he valued my safety. He pushed past me and walked down the hall toward the kitchen door. He opened it just a few inches and stuck his head into the garage. He sniffed the air twice. Then he closed the door and turned back to face me. "It is probably just a loose valve," he said, crossing his arms. "The temperature dropped tonight. Metal contracts in the cold." "But I can hear it hissing." I insisted, taking a step toward him. "We have to call someone. The space heater is running. It could spark." Richard rubbed his eyes. "Do you have any idea what the gas company charges for an emergency call out at 3 in the morning? They hit you with an overtime fee just to send a truck up the driveway. And then they will probably try to force me to replace the whole line. I am not paying $1,000 because you got spooked by a smell." I stared at him. The man tasked with protecting our family was doing mental math to weigh the cost of a plumbing repair against the risk of his house exploding. He avoided conflict and expense at all costs, even if the cost was my life. "Go back out there and unplug the heater," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Then just crack the bottom of the garage door a few inches to let the air circulate. You will be fine. I will call a local guy to look at it tomorrow afternoon when regular rates apply." I stood frozen in the hallway. "Let me ask you a question. At what point does a parent's financial stinginess cross the line into active criminal endangerment? When does trying to save a few dollars become a willingness to let your own child suffocate? Leave a comment and tell me where you draw the line." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to grab the phone off the kitchen counter and dial 911 myself. I wanted to tell him he was a coward who cared more about his bank account than his youngest daughter. But I did not. The psychological conditioning of living under his roof ran too deep. Years of being told I was a burden, a dramatic disruption, an unworthy investment had paralyzed my survival instincts. I was terrified of his wrath. I was terrified of Diana waking up and blaming me for causing a scene. "Okay," I whispered, staring at the floor. I turned around and walked back into the freezing garage. The smell was even stronger now, settling low to the ground. I walked over to the outlet and yanked the space heater cord from the wall, extinguishing the glowing orange coils. Then I walked to the heavy aluminum garage door. I pulled the manual release cord and lifted the door about 6 inches off the concrete floor. The coastal wind immediately rushed inside. It was 12 degrees outside. The freezing draft swept across the floor, cutting straight through my thin pajama pants. I walked back to my military cot and wrapped the wool blankets around my shaking body. I sat there in the dark for 2 excruciating hours. While Harper slept upstairs, breathing deeply through her expensive HEPA filtration system, surrounded by warm, climate-controlled comfort, I sat in the freezing darkness, inhaling faint, toxic fumes. The cold was unbearable, but I was too afraid to close the door and too afraid to go back inside the house. I sat there shivering, waiting for morning, praying the rusted pipe would not burst wide open. By 5:30, the sun began to slowly rise, turning the sky a pale, bruised purple. The wind shifted, blowing directly against the front of the house. The draft pushing under the cracked garage door grew stronger, forcing the trapped gas backward. It pushed the sulfuric fumes under the gap of the kitchen fire door and into the main house. I heard footsteps moving quickly across the floorboards above me. The heavy kitchen door swung open, and Diana stood on the threshold, holding her bathrobe closed. Her face was pale. The smell had finally reached the living room. It was no longer a problem confined to my space. It was now threatening her sanctuary. "Richard!" she screamed down the hallway, her voice echoing with panic. "The house reeks of gas. Get up right now!" She did not look at me sitting on the cot. She slammed the door shut, sealing herself back inside. A few minutes later, I heard the distinct sound of the heavy front door opening. Diana had called the local utility company. The municipal truck would arrive shortly, and when the worker stepped into the garage to inspect the pipes, he was going to find a lot more than just a rusted fitting. He was going to find the secret my parents had been hiding for 4 years. The heavy municipal utility truck pulled into our driveway just as the sun broke fully over the horizon. The tires crushed the hard-packed snow, sounding like grinding teeth in the quiet coastal morning. I watched from my military cot as the driver stepped out. His name was Thomas Gallagher. He wore a faded, high-visibility jacket over a heavy Carhartt sweatshirt. His boots hit the pavement with heavy, deliberate steps. He was a seasoned Massachusetts code enforcer, a man who had spent decades crawling through damp basements and inspecting corroded coastal infrastructure. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had seen every possible way a homeowner could cut corners to save $1. Thomas walked straight to the side of the house where the main gas meter sat against the foundation. He attached a handheld digital sniffer tool to the valves, checking for external leaks. Finding none, he turned his attention toward the heavy aluminum garage door, which I had left cracked open. He grabbed the handle and lifted it smoothly, the metal rollers squealing along the tracks. He stepped inside, tracking a mixture of rock salt and gray slush across the bare concrete floor. The blast of freezing morning air rushed in behind him, scattering the stale sulfuric smell. Thomas lifted a heavy metal flashlight, holding it at shoulder height, and pointed the beam up toward the exposed ceiling joists. He traced the rusted iron pipe following the hissing sound until the light landed squarely on the failing joint above my space heater. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a yellow roll of specialized utility tape, and marked the leaking section. Then he lowered his flashlight. The beam swept down the wall, past the workbench, past the stacked boxes of holiday decorations, and stopped dead. The bright white circle of light illuminated my high school chemistry book, resting on an overturned milk crate. It moved slowly across the dangerous nest of tangled extension cords, plugged into a single overloaded wall outlet. It traced the outline of the unplugged space heater. Finally, the beam rested right on me. I was sitting cross-legged on the canvas cot, shivering violently beneath the heavy wool blankets, my cracked and bloody toenail hidden inside a pair of thick wool socks. The hissing pipe above us continued to leak toxic fumes. But the unexpected twist hit me like a physical blow. Thomas Gallagher, the town employee, dispatched solely to secure a dangerous gas line, completely ignored the utility emergency. For a full agonizing minute, he stood perfectly still, staring at my makeshift life. His eyes moved from the military cot to the frost building up on the inside of the uninsulated single-pane windows. He looked at the bare drywall exposing raw fiberglass insulation, a massive fire hazard waiting to happen. He was processing the reality of the room. He was not looking at a storage space. He was looking at a frozen concrete prison cell designed for a teenager. Let me ask you something. What is the most terrifying thing a stranger has ever noticed about your private life? Have you ever had an outsider suddenly look past the facade your family carefully constructed and see the ugly reality hiding underneath? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know if you have ever felt that same suffocating exposure. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. I felt a rush of heat flood my face, burning my frozen cheeks. I was mortified. For 4 years, my parents had drilled it into my head that sleeping in the garage was a necessary sacrifice for my sister Harper. They convinced me that complaining about the cold was a sign of weakness. I had internalized their shame. I believed that my living conditions were a direct reflection of my own lack of worth. Having this rugged city worker stare at my pathetic frozen setup stripped away every defense mechanism I possessed. I did not act like a grateful victim waiting to be rescued. My imperfect moment took over. I aggressively defended the very people who put me in this position. I threw the wool blankets off my shoulders and stood up on the freezing concrete, ignoring the sharp pain in my foot. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest and glared at Thomas. "What are you staring at?" I snapped, my voice defensive and harsh. "It is just my private studio. I like it out here. I prefer the privacy. The house gets too crowded anyway." I was lying through my teeth, desperately trying to cover up my parents' neglect to salvage my own fragile pride. I wanted him to look away. I wanted him to fix the pipe and leave so I could go back to pretending my life was normal. Thomas did not argue with me. He did not tell me I was lying. He did not offer any pity. He simply clicked off his flashlight and hooked it onto his tool belt. He reached into his deep jacket pocket and pulled out a battered metal clipboard. A private studio, he repeated his thick coastal accent, flattening the vowels. His tone was impossible to read. Not mocking, just observant. He clicked a ballpoint pen. He did not ask me any questions. He started writing. He noted the lack of sealed drywall, a direct violation of municipal fire code. He wrote down the illegal overloaded power strips. He documented the absence of any central heating vents. He mapped out exactly what he saw: an unheated, uninsulated hazardous zone unfit for human habitation. I stood there trembling, watching his pen move across the paper. I felt a knot of pure dread twisting in my stomach. "Are you going to fix the pipe?" I asked, my voice losing its sharp edge, fading into a nervous whisper. "My dad wants to hire a local guy to do the repair, so you do not charge us emergency fees." Thomas looked up from his clipboard. His pale blue eyes met mine. He looked at me with a weary, profound sadness that made me want to shrink into the floor. "The pipe needs a full replacement, kid," he said, his voice quiet and firm. "The salt air ate right through the threads. But that is not what I am worried about right now." He turned around and walked back out into the freezing driveway. He did not walk toward the gas meter to shut off the main valve. He did not walk to his municipal truck to grab his heavy pipe wrenches or his radio to call dispatch. I walked slowly toward the open garage door, pulling my thin pajama shirt tight around my body. The wind bit at my bare arms. I peered around the metal door track, looking out into the driveway. Thomas stood near the back of his utility truck, shielded from the biting wind. From the frosted window, I watched him bypass his city-issued two-way radio entirely. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out his personal cell phone. He dialed a number, keeping his back turned toward our house, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He was not calling the utility company repair crew. Every municipal worker in Massachusetts, code enforcers, utility drivers, public school teachers, holds a specific legal designation. They are mandated reporters. By law, if they witness conditions that pose a severe immediate threat to the health or safety of a minor, they are legally obligated to report it to the state. Failure to do so can result in the loss of their job and criminal charges. Thomas Gallagher was looking at an unheated garage in the middle of a brutal New England winter, holding a shivering 17-year-old girl. He was calling the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching his breath puff into the cold air as he spoke into the phone. The dread in my stomach turned into sheer terror. The delicate, toxic balance my family had maintained for 4 years was about to violently collapse. The state was getting involved. And when the caseworker arrived at our front door, Diana and Richard were not going to accept responsibility. They were going to fight back. And the fallout from their defense was going to be infinitely worse than the freezing cold. The waiting was worse than the cold. I sat on my cot, clutching the wool blankets, my eyes fixed on the fire door leading to the kitchen. 3 hours had passed since Thomas Gallagher drove his utility truck away from our driveway. He had eventually shut off the main gas valve to stop the leak leaving the house without heat or hot water, but he refused to speak to my father before leaving. The silence inside the house was heavy, suffocating, and electric with panic. At 10:15 in the morning, a plain gray sedan pulled into our slush-covered driveway. A woman stepped out. She did not wear a uniform, just a practical dark winter coat and sensible flat boots. She carried a thick leather portfolio. Her name was Evelyn. She was a senior caseworker for the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. I watched her walk up the front steps and ring the bell. A moment later, the heavy fire door swung open, and my father ordered me into the kitchen. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. The house was already growing chilly without the gas furnace running. Richard stood leaning against the granite countertop, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. My mother. Diana sat at the head of the polished oak table, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Evelyn sat across from her, placing a digital audio recorder and a stack of forms on the table. "Sit down, Scarlett," Evelyn said, her voice calm, even and entirely devoid of judgment. She pointed to a chair at the far end of the table away from my parents. I sat down, my hands shaking in my lap. I felt like a criminal on trial. Evelyn clicked the recorder on. She stated the date, the time, and the address for the record. Then she looked directly at my mother. "Mrs. Gallagher, the town code inspector reported finding your 17-year-old daughter sleeping on a military cot in an unheated garage. He noted a severe gas leak, an illegal space heater, and a lack of proper insulation." Can you explain why Scarlett is living in a non-habitable structure during a severe winter advisory? I braced myself, waiting for Diana to crumble. I expected her to cry, to invent a lie about pest control or renovations, to claim it was only a temporary arrangement. That is what abusive parents do when cornered by the state right. They lie to protect themselves. But the unexpected twist hit me like a physical strike. Diana did not cower. She did not lower her eyes. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table, her gaze locking onto Evelyn with intense, burning conviction. "I am raising my daughter to survive the real world," Diana stated, her voice thick with a gritty South Boston accent she usually tried to hide around the neighbors. "The real world does not care if you are comfortable. The real world breaks you if you are soft." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her pen hovering over her notepad. "Leaving a teenager in sub-freezing temperatures is not teaching survival, Mrs. Gallagher. It is active endangerment. You do not know the first thing about survival." Diana fired back, her volume rising, a raw, unpolished fury spilling into her words. "I grew up in a triple-decker tenement in Southie. The wind used to blow straight through the cracked window panes. We did not have a fancy HVAC system. We had an old radiator that barely worked. When I was 9 years old, my little sister caught pneumonia because the draft was so bad. She died in the hospital 3 weeks later because we were too poor to afford a private doctor and too soft to handle the cold." The kitchen went dead silent. Richard stared at the floor, refusing to look at anyone. This was the dark, buried trauma my mother carried like a badge of honor. She had spent her entire adult life running from that grinding poverty, climbing the social ladder, marrying a municipal accountant, moving to a nice coastal suburb. But she never left the terror behind. She genuinely believed that physical comfort bred deadly weakness. "Scarlett is strong," Diana continued, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Harper needs the filtered air inside the house because her lungs are fragile. But Scarlett is tough. She needs to know how to weather the storm. I am making her resilient. I am protecting her from ending up like my sister. She has to learn how to fight through the cold." I stared at my mother. The sheer, unadulterated conviction in her eyes made my stomach churn. "Let me ask you a question. Can someone deeply, severely traumatize you while honestly, wholeheartedly believing they are saving your life? Can abuse be wrapped in a twisted, pathological form of maternal protection? Drop a comment and tell me if you have ever faced someone whose good intentions destroyed you." Diana was not a cartoon villain laughing maniacally while I froze. She was a deeply broken, traumatized woman projecting her own crushing survivor guilt onto her youngest daughter. She was engineering my suffering out of a desperate, twisted need to prove that toughness could conquer death, and the profound grief of that realization was suffocating. I realized in that moment that she would never apologize because she truly believed she was right. Evelyn listened to the entire speech without interrupting. Her face remained a carefully composed mask of bureaucratic neutrality. She wrote a few quick notes on her form. "Trauma does not rewrite state law, Mrs. Gallagher," Evelyn said, her voice flat and unyielding. "The building codes in Massachusetts dictate that a primary residence must maintain a minimum temperature of 68 degrees during winter months. The garage lacks insulation, proper ventilation, and safe egress. You have placed your minor child in an illegal, hazardous environment. The psychological motivation behind your actions does not mitigate the legal reality of child endangerment." Diana scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "You bureaucratic paper pushers think a few state guidelines know better than a mother who actually survived the streets. She is fine. Look at her." Evelyn finally turned her attention away from my mother and focused directly on me. Her pale blue eyes softened just a fraction. "Scarlett," Evelyn asked, leaning closer, "I need you to answer me honestly. Do you feel safe in this house?" This was my moment. This was the cinematic climax where the brave, resilient protagonist looks the state worker in the eye, delivers a perfectly articulate speech about overcoming adversity, and marches out the door toward a brighter future. But I was not a cinematic hero. I was a terrified 17-year-old girl functioning on 3 hours of sleep, freezing, shivering, and deeply damaged by years of emotional neglect. I looked at Evelyn. Then I looked at Diana, who was glaring at me silently, demanding that I defend her twisted parenting methods. The weight of the last 4 years, the cold, the gas leak, the stolen wool blankets, the absolute lack of love crushed me all at once. My imperfect moment took over. I completely broke down. I did not cry softly. I started hyperventilating, my chest heaving, struggling to pull air into my lungs. A massive wave of pure, unfiltered rage boiled up from the pit of my stomach. I reached out and grabbed the heavy ceramic coffee mug resting on the table near my father's elbow. I violently swept my arms sideways, hurling the mug off the table. It smashed against the hardwood floor, sending sharp shards of ceramic and cold coffee exploding across the kitchen. "I hate you!" I screamed at Diana, my voice tearing at my throat, raw and jagged. "I hate you. You do not care if I am tough. You just care about Harper. You want me to freeze. I hate living here. I want to leave. Get me out of here." I lost all composure, sobbing hysterically, clutching my hands to my face. I was screaming like a cornered animal, entirely stripped of any dignity or maturity in front of the state caseworker. Richard took a step back, holding his hands up, refusing to intervene. Diana sat frozen, her jaw tight, her eyes flashing with indignant anger. Evelyn did not flinch when the mug shattered. She simply picked up her digital recorder, clicked it off, and slid it into her leather portfolio. She gathered her paperwork and stood up. The psychological debate was over. The messy, emotional outburst provided all the confirmation she needed. "The state is stepping in," Evelyn announced, addressing Richard directly, ignoring Diana entirely. "You have a documented severe code violation, a confirmed gas leak, and a minor child exhibiting extreme emotional distress, indicative of a highly unstable domestic environment. I am initiating an emergency temporary removal order. Scarlett will not be spending another night in that garage." Richard finally spoke, his voice tight with panic. "Wait a minute. A removal. You cannot just take her. We can fix the heat. We can move a bed into the living room." Evelyn zipped her portfolio shut, her gaze cold and sharp. "You had 4 years to buy a bed, Mr. Gallagher. You lost that privilege the moment the inspector called my office." She turned to me. "Pack a bag, Scarlett. You have 20 minutes. I stood up, my legs trembling, stepping carefully over the broken ceramic shards on the floor. I walked toward the fire door leading back to the garage to pack my meager belongings into a black plastic trash bag. The state was taking me away from the cold, but as I walked down the hallway, I heard my sister Harper's bedroom door click open, and her reaction to my removal was going to introduce a new, entirely different kind of nightmare. The word removal hung in the kitchen air like thick, humid smoke. Evelyn, the DCF caseworker, stood by the front door holding her leather portfolio, waiting for me to gather my belongings. I pushed through the heavy fire door one last time, stepping back into the freezing garage. The air was frigid now that the main utility valve was shut off. The lingering scent of sulfur was slowly fading, replaced by the sharp, biting smell of the coastal ocean wind pushing through the cracked aluminum door. I grabbed a thick black plastic trash bag from the workbench. I did not own a suitcase. I started stuffing my clothes inside, tossing in a few pairs of jeans, heavy wool socks, my high school chemistry textbook, and the 3 stolen Pendleton blankets that had kept me alive the night before. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the plastic strings together. I dragged the bag back into the main house. The hallway was quiet, but as I reached the bottom of the carpeted stairs, I saw my sister Harper. She stood on the landing, clutching her expensive prescription inhaler, her pale blue eyes wide with panic. The golden child was finally forced out of her climate-controlled sanctuary. I stopped at the bottom step looking up at her. For 4 years, my parents had used her fragile health as the absolute justification for my exile. I had suffered through sub-zero nights, frozen pipes, and toxic gas leaks supposedly to protect her lungs. I waited for her to apologize. I waited for her to tell the caseworker that she did not know how bad it was out there in the garage. I waited for some shred of sisterly solidarity. Harper clutched the wooden banister, leaning over the edge to look into the kitchen, where Richard was pacing furiously, making frantic phone calls. Dad Harper called out, her voice tight and whiny. If the state finds out about the garage, does this mean they are going to fine you? Are you going to have to pay legal fees?" Richard stopped pacing, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Yes, Harper, this is going to be incredibly expensive. The town code violations alone are going to cost thousands." Harper gripped her inhaler tighter, her knuckles turning white. "But what about my car insurance? You said you were going to pay the premium this week. Does this mean I have to get a job now to cover it myself? I cannot work in an office right now, Dad. My anxiety will trigger an asthma attack. You know I cannot handle the stress." I stood at the bottom of the stairs, clutching my black plastic trash bag, feeling a profound hollow shock settle deep into my bones. "Let me ask you something. How do you react when the person you sacrificed your entire childhood for only mourns their own minor financial inconvenience? Have you ever watched someone you suffered for look right past your pain because they were worried about losing a small privilege? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know if you have ever felt that specific kind of invisible betrayal. Harper did not feel a single ounce of pity for me. She did not care that I was being taken away by a state agency. She was entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of having to pay her own car insurance now that our parents faced legal fines. Her fragility, which Diana used as a weapon to banish me, had become a comfortable permanent trap for her. She lacked any basic survival skills, because my parents had relentlessly shielded her from every minor discomfort. My imperfect moment struck fast and sharp. I did not take the high road. I did not offer her a wise, empathetic goodbye. I dropped my trash bag on the floor and stared up at her. The rage that had shattered the coffee mug in the kitchen boiled up again, hot and toxic. "I hope your lungs collapse, Harper." I snapped, my voice laced with pure, concentrated malice. "I hope you choke on that expensive filtered air while you are working the drive-through window paying for your own insurance. You are pathetic." The moment the cruel words left my mouth, a sharp wave of deep shame washed over me. Harper gasped, clutching her chest, tears springing to her eyes, immediately playing the victim role she had perfected. Richard yelled my name from the kitchen, but I grabbed my bag and walked out the front door before he could reach the hallway. I was acting just as toxic as the environment that raised me, lashing out to inflict pain because I was hurting. I hated myself for saying it, but I could not take it back. I followed Evelyn to her gray sedan, tossing my bag into the trunk. As I slid into the passenger seat, I looked back at the split-level house. The coastal wind was tearing at the dead winter grass on the front lawn. I was leaving the garage behind, but the true nightmare was just beginning. The foster system in Massachusetts is not a warm, comforting embrace. It is a cold, sprawling, bureaucratic machine severely underfunded and hopelessly overcrowded. Evelyn drove me to a temporary emergency placement facility in a neighboring town. It was a cinder-block building with harsh fluorescent lights, heavily scuffed linoleum floors, and a pervasive smell of bleach and institutional cabbage. I was placed in a holding room with 4 other teenage girls, waiting for a judge to review my case and officially declare me a ward of the state. I sat on a plastic chair staring at the clock ticking on the wall. I felt entirely unmoored, a ghost floating through a sterile system that categorized trauma into neat manila folders. But while I sat in that holding room, Richard and Diana were not sitting idly by. Richard was a municipal accountant who understood exactly how legal liability worked. He knew that a formal DCF removal, combined with the town code violations, would destroy his pristine neighborhood reputation and potentially jeopardize his town pension. He panicked. He immediately hired a sharp, aggressive local defense attorney to block the state intervention. 48 hours after I was removed, Evelyn walked into the holding room, her face grim, holding a thick legal file. She sat down across from me, sliding a piece of paper across the metal table. "Your parents filed an emergency injunction," Evelyn explained, her voice tight with frustration. "Their lawyer is arguing that the garage was merely a temporary storage space and that you chose to sleep out there as an act of teenage rebellion. They are claiming you are severely mentally unstable, prone to violent outbursts, and have a history of running away." I stared at her, the blood draining from my face. "They are lying," I whispered. You saw the garage. You saw the space heater and the cot. Evelyn sighed, tapping her pen against the file. I know they are lying, Scarlett. The code inspector knows they are lying, but your parents have money and they have a lawyer who knows how to stall the system. They are demanding a full psychological evaluation before the court officially terminates their parental rights. They are arguing that DCF overstepped its bounds by removing you without a prior history of police intervention. What does that mean for me? I asked, my voice trembling. It means a judge has scheduled a preliminary hearing for next week, Evelyn replied, looking me dead in the eye. Until that hearing concludes, you are stuck in legal limbo. And if the judge sides with their lawyer pending the psychological evaluation, they might order a reunification mandate. They might force you to go back to the house while we conduct a long-term investigation. The thought of going back to that house, back to the freezing concrete floor, back to Diana's twisted survival lectures, sent a jolt of pure blinding panic straight through my nervous system. I could not go back. If I went back, they would lock me in that garage and make sure no inspector ever saw me again. They would punish me for the legal fees I had cost them. I made a drastic, terrifying decision. I waited until nightfall when the skeletal staff at the emergency facility was busy dealing with a new intake. I grabbed my black plastic trash bag, walked out the side emergency exit, and fled into the freezing Massachusetts night. I ran into the shadows, deliberately escaping the very system designed to protect me. I couch-surfed with a few casual acquaintances from high school, sleeping on damp basement sofas in neighboring towns, keeping my head down to avoid the local police. I avoided using my phone and paid for cheap food with the few cash dollars I had saved from a summer tutoring job. By running away, I successfully avoided being forced back into the garage. I survived the immediate threat by disappearing, but I had no idea that my escape was a massive tactical error. By fleeing the facility before the judge could officially rule on my case, I unknowingly severed the legal paperwork required to prove my abuse. I was never officially legally declared a ward of the state. I became a ghost in the system, undocumented and unverified. And when my 18th birthday arrived a few months later, the legal window for DCF intervention permanently closed. I thought I was free. I thought I had outsmarted my parents and the slow-moving court system. I graduated high school quietly collecting my diploma without my parents in the audience. I set my sights on applying to a state university, desperate to build a life far away from Cape Ann. But when I sat down in the financial aid office to submit my college applications, I triggered a bureaucratic trap that would nearly destroy my future. The legacy of my parents' abuse was not finished with me yet. It was waiting inside the federal student aid system, ready to pull me under. The reality of turning 18 in America when you are completely estranged from your family is that the government does not suddenly hand you the keys to independence. The system is rigidly designed with the assumption that your parents are actively participating in your transition to adulthood. If they are not, you are practically invisible. I learned this harsh lesson sitting in a cramped, fluorescent-lit financial aid office at a state university near Boston. The air smelled of old coffee and printer toner. I had spent the summer after high school graduation piecing my life together. I rented a tiny damp room in the basement of a shared house, paying my rent with cash. I earned working retail. I had the grades to get into a decent maritime history program, and I needed to escape the cycle of poverty my mother Diana had grown up in. I handed my free application for federal student aid forms to a clerk sitting behind a thick plexiglass partition. She was a middle-aged woman wearing a lanyard covered in university pins, typing rhythmically on her keyboard. She paused, clicking her mouse a few times, and frowned at her screen. "Miss Gallagher, your application is incomplete," she said, sliding the paperwork back under the slot in the glass. "You did not provide your parents' tax information or their signatures. You cannot process a federal loan or receive Pell Grants without parental financial data until you are 24 years old. I am legally independent," I told her, leaning closer to the glass, my heart rate picking up. "I do not live with my parents. I have no contact with them. I support myself." The clerk sighed, pulling a laminated flowchart from beneath her keyboard. "Living on your own does not make you legally independent for federal financial aid purposes. She explained, her tone bored and rehearsed. "Unless you are married, an active duty military member, or a legally documented ward of the state, you are classified as a dependent student. We need their tax returns." My stomach dropped. The cold, clinical reality of the bureaucracy was setting in. "They will not give me their tax returns," I said, my voice tightening. "They kicked me out. Well, technically, I ran away from a DCF holding facility because they were trying to force me back into an unheated garage. The state removed me. I have a caseworker." The clerk looked up from her screen, her expression shifting from bored to weary skepticism. "If you were removed by the Department of Children and Families, you should have a court order declaring you a ward of the state. If you can provide that official legal decree, I can process a dependency override." I stared at her, the blood roaring in my ears. The brilliant tactical escape I had engineered to save myself from the garage had just slammed like an iron gate across my future. By running away before the judge could rule on my case, I had severed the exact paperwork this clerk needed. I was not officially a ward of the state. I was just a runaway who had aged out of the system in the shadows. "I do not have the court order," I admitted, my voice shaking. "But I have the DCF file number. Evelyn is my caseworker. The town inspector called them. You can call the town office. They can verify everything." "I am sorry, Miss Gallagher," the clerk said, sliding my incomplete application back toward me. "We do not conduct field investigations. The federal guidelines are strict. Without the court decree or parental tax information, your application is denied. You can reapply if you secure their signatures." "Next in line, please. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been punished by a system because your trauma did not fit neatly into their required paperwork? Have you ever survived an impossible situation only to have a clerk sitting in a comfortable chair tell you that your survival was not properly documented? Leave a comment and tell me if you have ever hit a bureaucratic wall that made you want to scream. My imperfect moment ignited like dry kindling. All the exhaustion, the fear, the endless nights shivering on a military cot, the shame of wearing damp clothes, the fury at Harper smoking out her window, it all boiled over in that sterile financial aid office. I did not take a deep breath and ask for an appeal form. I completely lost my temper. I slammed my fists down on the laminate counter in front of the plexiglass partition hard enough to make her keyboard jump. "Are you kidding me?" I screamed, my voice echoing off the cinder block walls. "I lived on concrete for 4 years. My mother told a state worker she wanted me to freeze to make me tough. My father tried to let me choke on a gas leak to save $100. I cannot just go ask them for their W-2 forms. They do not care if I go to college. They do not care if I die." The clerk pushed her rolling chair back from the desk, startled, reaching for the phone. "Miss, you need to lower your voice or I am calling campus security." "Call them!" I yelled back, tears of pure, blinding frustration burning my eyes. "Call the security guards. Maybe they can write me a police report so you can check a box on your stupid clipboard. You are holding my entire future hostage because I ran away instead of waiting for a judge to send me back to the people who abused me." Several students waiting in line stepped back, looking at me with alarmed, uncomfortable expressions. The security guard stationed near the entrance began walking briskly toward the counter, resting his hand on his radio. I grabbed my incomplete paperwork, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it at the plexiglass before storming out of the admissions building. I walked fast, my chest heaving, fighting the urge to collapse onto the campus lawn. I had survived my parents only to be blocked by a federal flowchart. The next 6 months were a grinding, soul-crushing timeline of appeals, red tape, and relentless exhaustion. I learned that getting a dependency override without a ward of the state decree required an overwhelming burden of proof. I had to secure sworn legal affidavits from mandated reporters who could independently verify my abusive living conditions. I had to track down Inspector Thomas Gallagher. I found him working at the municipal building in Cape Ann. He looked at me with that same weary, sad expression he had the morning he found me in the garage. He did not hesitate. He wrote a detailed, notarized affidavit confirming the hazardous conditions, the gas leak, and my parents' refusal to address the code violations. Then I had to find Evelyn. She was harder to track down, buried under a mountain of active DCF caseloads. When I finally reached her, she was frustrated that I had run away from the facility, but she agreed to submit a redacted summary of her initial field report, detailing Diana's alarming statements during the kitchen interrogation. While I waited for the university committee to slowly review my massive stack of appeal paperwork, I had to survive. I could not take out student loans, so I paid for a single class out of pocket using every dollar I had. I secured a job working overnight shifts at a local maritime archive museum on the coast. The pay was slightly above minimum wage, but the hours were brutal. From midnight to 8 in the morning, I sat in a damp temperature-controlled basement, sorting through fragile, moldy shipping logs from the 1800s. I cataloged whaling manifests, property deeds, and coastal trade records. The heavy scent of old paper and sea salt permeated my clothes. My eyes burned from reading faded cursive handwriting under dim preservation lights. After my shift, I would sleep for 4 hours in my rented basement room, wrapping myself in the stolen wool blankets to save money on heating bills. Then I would go to my single afternoon class and spend the evening studying in the library. I lived on cheap black coffee and peanut butter sandwiches. I was exhausted to my very core. My hypervigilance born in the garage kept me functioning on sheer adrenaline. The archival work was tedious, but I discovered something crucial during those lonely overnight shifts. My trauma had rewired my brain. Living in constant fear of my parents' shifting moods had taught me to notice tiny details others ignored. I became incredibly meticulous. I could spot discrepancies in complex shipping manifests that had gone unnoticed for decades. I learned how to track property ownership through convoluted legal trusts, tracing generational wealth back to the original coastal merchants. I was building a skill set that would eventually become my most dangerous weapon. I was learning how to hunt through legal documents. Just as the university finally approved my dependency override, granting me access to the financial aid I desperately needed, the ghost of my past reached out. I returned to my rented room after a grueling overnight shift to find a thick, slightly crumpled envelope resting in my mailbox. There was no return address, but I recognized the sharp, slanted handwriting immediately. It was from Diana. My mother had found me, and the letter inside was not a threat or a demand for me to return home. It was something far more twisted and deeply tragic. She was reaching out to justify the nightmare she had put me through, and her explanation would force me to confront the darkest part of our family history. The envelope felt unusually heavy in my cold hands. The sharp, slanted handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Diana had found my address. I stood in the damp entryway of my shared basement apartment, the smell of stale cooking oil lingering in the air from my roommate's dinner. It had been over a year since I fled the DCF holding facility. I had not spoken a single word to my parents or Harper since the day Evelyn drove me away from the split-level house. I walked into my cramped bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the envelope. I expected it to be a furious demand to return home, or perhaps a legal threat from Richard regarding the town code fines. I tore the flap open. A small, rectangular piece of paper fluttered out, landing face up on my worn quilt. It was a personal check signed by Diana, written out to me for exactly $50. I pulled out the thick stack of folded lined paper. There were 4 pages filled edge to edge with her frantic, pressing handwriting. It was not a demand. It was not an apology. It was a chilling, terrifyingly lucid window into the fractured mind of the woman who had engineered my suffering. Scarlett. The letter began without a standard greeting. You think I am a monster. The state worker looked at me like I was a criminal. Richard blames me for the legal fees, and Harper cries because the house is tense. But none of them understand what it takes to survive. You ran away because you thought the cold was a punishment. It was not. It was a crucible. I was trying to save your life. I read the words, my chest tightening. She was doubling down. But as I read further, the tone of the letter shifted from aggressive defense to a haunting, vivid memory. You do not know what a real winter feels like, Diana wrote. You grew up in a coastal suburb with paved roads and grocery stores. When I was 9 years old, my family lived in a rotting triple-decker tenement in South Boston. The landlord never fixed the boiler. We could see our breath in the living room from November to March. My mother worked 2 shifts scrubbing floors, and she was too exhausted to fight the landlord. She just told us to wrap up. The handwriting became erratic, the pressure of the pen digging deep grooves into the paper. My little sister Mary was 6. She was fragile. She had a soft cough that turned into a deep, rattling bark. We did not have insurance. We did not have a car to get to the free clinic. One night, the temperature dropped below 0. The wind blew right through the cracked window pane in our bedroom. My mother was desperate. She took old newspapers and wrapped them around Mary's chest under her pajamas, trying to insulate her lungs against the draft. I sat on the floor, watching the ink stain my sister's skin. Mary cried because the paper was stiff and uncomfortable. I held her hand while she gasped for air. She died 3 days later in a charity ward. She suffocated because her lungs filled with fluid. She died because we were poor and because she was too weak to fight the cold. I lowered the letter, my hands trembling. The image of a frantic, exhausted mother wrapping a dying child in old newspapers to ward off the freezing Boston winter was horrifying. "Weakness is a death sentence," Scarlett Diana continued. "I swore I would never let my children be weak. When Harper was born with fragile lungs, it terrified me. I saw Mary all over again. I knew Harper would not survive if the world pushed her too hard, so I shielded her. I gave her the warm room. I gave her the filtered air. I gave her the comfort because she was broken. But you were strong. You had fire in you. I put you in that garage so the cold would seep into your bones and teach your body how to fight. I wanted you to know that you could survive anything. I gave you the greatest gift a mother can give. I gave you resilience. Buy yourself a hot meal with the enclosed check. Stay tough." The letter ended without a signature. I sat in the dim light of my basement room holding the pages. Let me ask you a question. What do you do when you realize your abuser is not a cartoon villain, but a profoundly broken person projecting their own unresolved trauma onto you? Do you keep a toxic person's olive branch, or do you burn it to protect your peace? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know how you would handle an apology wrapped in abuse. A deep, confusing pity washed over me, settling heavy in my stomach. Diana was not a sadist laughing at my pain. She was a traumatized survivor of grinding working-class poverty, suffering from extreme untreated PTSD. She looked at me and saw her dead sister. She subjected me to hypothermia and toxic gas leaks because her warped, broken mind believed she was inoculating me against death. The realization did not bring comfort. It brought a suffocating grief. It meant that I could never fix her. I could never explain my pain to her because her pain was so loud it drowned out everything else. I was a casualty of a tragedy that happened decades before I was even born. I looked down at the $50 check resting on the quilt. My imperfect moment rose up, crushing my moral high ground. I wanted to be the strong, independent survivor who tore the check into pieces and mailed it back to her. I wanted to prove that I did not need her twisted blood money. I wanted to reject the narrative that the garage had made me tough. But my stomach growled. A sharp, painful cramp twisted my abdomen. I had worked an 8-hour overnight shift at the Maritime Archive and eaten nothing but a plain bagel in the last 24 hours. My bank account was overdrawn by $12. I was starving. I picked up the check. I walked out of my apartment and down the street to the local bank branch. I slid the check into the ATM, my hands shaking. When the machine dispensed the 2 $20 bills and a 10, I grabbed the cash and leaned my forehead against the cold metal casing of the ATM. I stood there on the busy sidewalk, sobbing quietly, pulling my jacket tight around my chest. I felt intensely ashamed. I had traded my dignity for $50 because my hunger was stronger than my pride. Diana had won a sick, twisted victory. She proved that I was desperate enough to accept her scraps to survive. I wiped my eyes, shoved the cash into my pocket, and walked straight to the grocery store. I bought peanut butter bread, cheap coffee, and a bag of apples. I survived the week on Diana's trauma money. I folded the letter and put it in a shoebox under my bed. I did not reply. I never reached out. I buried myself in my work at the Maritime Archive, allowing the grueling hours and the scent of old paper to consume my life. Over the next few years, I settled into a rhythm of bone-deep fatigue. I transitioned to a full-time archival position after finally securing my financial aid and stabilizing my college schedule. I spent my days surrounded by dead history, meticulously preserving 19th century shipping manifests and coastal property deeds. The hypervigilance I had developed in the garage served me well. I could spot a forged signature or a discrepancy in a property transfer instantly. My trauma had sharpened my focus, turning me into a relentless researcher. I isolated myself completely. My colleagues invited me out for drinks after work, but I always declined. I snapped at them when they asked too many questions about my personal life, pushing them away before they could get close enough to see the damage Diana had inflicted. I preferred the safety of dead paper over the terrifying risk of human relationships. I thought I had successfully detached myself from my family. I thought the silence would last forever. But the coastal towns of Massachusetts are small, and the past has a funny way of bumping into you when you least expect it. I was 22 years old, navigating the produce aisle of a local grocery store in a neighboring town, examining a display of winter squash. I turned the corner of the aisle, pushing my squeaky cart, and stopped dead. Standing 10 feet away, staring directly at a shelf of organic apples, was my father, Richard. He was wearing his usual tailored winter coat, his graying hair combed neatly back, looking exactly like the respectable municipal accountant he prided himself on being. He reached for an apple and glanced to his right. His eyes locked onto mine. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He stood frozen, holding the apple, caught completely off guard by the daughter he had tried to let choke on a gas leak. And his reaction to seeing me was going to trigger a furious, explosive response that I would deeply regret. The fluorescent lights of the grocery store buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow across the produce aisle. I stood frozen, my hands gripping the cold metal bar of my shopping cart, staring at the man who had authorized my banishment. I was 22 years old now. It had been 5 years since the DCF caseworker drove me away from the split-level house. I had spent those years grinding through college classes and working grueling 40-hour weeks at the Maritime Archive building, a life from absolute scratch. Richard stood 10 feet away, clutching an organic apple. He was 56 now, but he looked exactly the same. The same tailored wool coat, the same polished municipal accountant demeanor, the same careful posture of a man deeply obsessed with neighborhood optics. For a single suspended moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, loaded with 5 years of unspoken accusations. I waited for him to say something. I braced myself for a defensive remark, an awkward greeting, or perhaps a weak attempt to ask how I was doing. I expected him to act like an adult. But Richard Gallagher was not an adult when faced with discomfort. He was a coward. The pale shock on his face shifted rapidly into pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted nervously toward the other shoppers in the aisle, terrified that someone might witness an uncomfortable family confrontation. He dropped the apple back into the display bin. He gripped the handle of his cart, pivoting sharply on his heel. Without saying a single word, he turned his back on me and pushed his cart aggressively down the aisle, retreating toward the dairy section at a near run. He was fleeing. He was literally running away in a grocery store rather than look his youngest daughter in the eye. Let me ask you something. What hurts more? Is it the active malice of an abuser who inflicts pain directly, or is it the complete cowardly avoidance of the enabler who turns their back and pretends you do not exist? Drop a comment below and tell me which wound cuts deeper. I stood in the aisle staring at the empty space where my father had just been. A rush of hot, furious blood pounded in my ears. Diana had been cruel, but her cruelty was rooted in a twisted, traumatic logic. Richard was worse. Richard was simply weak. He had allowed me to freeze in an uninsulated garage. He had told me to breathe toxic gas to save a plumbing fee. He had lawyered up to block my state removal to protect his town pension. And now, after 5 years of silence, he could not even muster the basic human decency to acknowledge my existence in public. He treated me like a shameful mistake he had successfully erased. My imperfect moment hijacked my rational brain. The careful, composed archivist who spent her days preserving delicate historical documents vanished. The furious, abandoned 17-year-old girl clawed her way back to the surface. I shoved my shopping cart aside, abandoning my groceries in the middle of the aisle. I walked quickly, tracking him through the store. I saw the back of his wool coat disappearing through the automatic sliding doors at the front entrance, leaving his own abandoned cart near the registers. He was desperate to escape. I pushed through the exit doors, the cold coastal wind hitting my face. I watched him walking fast across the asphalt parking lot, digging his keys out of his pocket. He approached his silver Honda Civic, the exact car he had always parked carefully in our driveway. He unlocked it, tossing his coat into the back seat, completely unaware that I was 50 feet behind him. I did not yell his name. I did not confront him. The rage inside me bypassed words entirely. I reached into my deep coat pocket and pulled out my heavy brass house key. I walked purposefully, keeping my head down, blending into the foot traffic of shoppers loading their cars. I passed the rear bumper of his Honda, just as he climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. I pressed the jagged edge of my brass key hard against the pristine silver paint of his rear quarter panel. I kept the pressure firm and dragged the key in a long, continuous, deep scratch, running the entire length of the passenger side doors, digging right down to the bare primer metal. The horrific screeching sound of metal gouging metal was loud, but the wind muffled it just enough. I did not stop walking. I did not look back. I kept my pace steady, slipping between rows of parked cars until I reached my rusty 10-year-old sedan parked near the back lot. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and gripped the steering wheel. My chest was heaving. My hands were shaking so violently I could not get the key into the ignition. A wave of crushing, nauseating regret washed over me instantly. What had I just done? I had committed a juvenile petty act of criminal vandalism. I had stooped to the lowest possible level, acting out in a grocery store parking lot, because I lacked the emotional maturity to process my father's cowardice. I was terrified he would check his mirrors, see the damage, and call the police. I had worked too hard to build an independent life to ruin it over a scratched Honda. I started my car and drove out of the lot, my heart hammering in my throat, convinced a cruiser was going to pull me over at any second. Richard never called the police. He never filed a report. He simply absorbed the damage, avoiding the conflict exactly as he always did. His silence was the ultimate proof of his character. He would rather pay for an expensive paint repair out of pocket than risk an investigation that might force him to interact with me. I drove straight to the Maritime Archive Museum. I had a key to the staff entrance, and I needed a place to hide. The archive was located in a massive brick building right on the Cape Ann Harbor, overlooking the freezing Atlantic. The lower level where I worked was a climate-controlled vault designed to preserve 19th-century shipping manifests, coastal property deeds, and whaling logs. It smelled of old binding glue sea salt and decades of undisturbed dust. I swiped my badge and walked into the silent, dimly lit vault. I sat down at my preservation desk, surrounded by towering stacks of acid-free storage boxes. I rested my head on the cool metal desk, closing my eyes. I felt a bone-deep fatigue settle into my muscles. The encounter with Richard proved that I was still profoundly broken. I could not function normally in the real world. I was a hyper-vigilant defensive mess. So I leaned into my isolation. Over the next 3 years, I alienated the few casual friends I had made in college. When a coworker invited me out for a drink after a long shift, I snapped at her, claiming I had too much cataloging to finish. When a classmate tried to study with me, I pushed him away, convinced he would eventually find out about my background and pity me. I built a fortress of dead paper around myself. I preferred the predictable safety of historical documents over the terrifying, unpredictable risk of human relationships. Documents did not lie. Documents did not turn their backs on you in the produce aisle. My obsession with the archives turned me into an exceptional researcher. I learned how to track the complex lineage of coastal properties, tracing land ownership through convoluted generations of wealthy shipping families. I could spot a forged signature on a 19th century manifest or a discrepancy in a modern property deed instantly. My brain, trained to constantly scan my environment for threats in the garage, now scanned legal documents for anomalies. I was 25 years old, working full-time as the senior archivist, when the careful, isolated life I had built was suddenly violently interrupted. I arrived at my rented apartment after a long shift to find a certified legal notice waiting in my mailbox. The return address belonged to a high-powered corporate law firm located in downtown Boston. I sat at my small kitchen table, my heart racing as I tore open the thick parchment envelope. Inside was a formal legal letter, printed on heavy embossed paper. The language was dense, packed with confusing legalese, but the core message was clear. It was a request regarding a family trust. The letter stated that my paternal grandfather, who had passed away years ago, had established a generational trust involving a coastal property. The lawyers were writing to inform me that my parents, Richard and Diana, wished to generously disperse a minor portion of the trust equity to me early. All I needed to do was sign the enclosed release forms, surrendering my future claim to the asset, and they would wire a modest sum of money to my account. I stared at the letter, the familiar scent of a trap lingering in the formal language. Why would the parents who let me freeze in a garage suddenly hire an expensive Boston law firm to offer me an early inheritance payout? It was a red herring, and my instinct to investigate was about to uncover a massive hidden financial disaster that would put the fate of my abusers entirely in my hands. The heavy embossed legal paper felt toxic in my hands. The letterhead read, Harrison and Vance Attorneys at Law, Boston, Massachusetts. I was 25 years old, sitting in my cramped coastal apartment, staring at a certified legal notice dispatched by the people who had erased me. The wording of the letter was incredibly precise, designed to sound benevolent while burying the actual mechanics of the transaction in dense legal jargon. The letter stated that a minor generational trust established by my late paternal grandfather was undergoing a routine administrative restructuring. My father, Richard, acting as the primary trustee, wished to generously disperse an early payout of $10,000 to me. The letter claimed this was an olive branch, a gesture of family goodwill to help me establish my independence. To accept this generous gift, all I had to do was sign the enclosed waiver, surrendering my future rights to the trust, and mail it back in the prepaid envelope provided. A wave of sudden, sharp anxiety spiked through my chest, hitting me so hard my vision blurred. Let me ask you a question. When the people who threw you away suddenly extend a manicured legal olive branch, holding a check in one hand and a waiver in the other, do you negotiate? Do you take the cash and walk away knowing there is a catch? Or do you dig until you find the trap? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know if you would sign the paper or burn it. For 8 years, I had survived without a single dollar of support from Richard or Diana. I had worked grueling overnight shifts, slept in damp basements, and built a meticulous career as a maritime archivist entirely on my own. I knew my father. Richard was a cowardly municipal accountant who avoided conflict and clung to his money like a life raft. He did not give generous gifts out of sudden paternal guilt. He calculated every cent. If he was willing to pay a high-priced Boston law firm to track me down and offer me $10,000, it meant that my signature was worth significantly more than that. The letter was a red herring. It was bait. My imperfect moment struck, overriding my rational archival brain. The trauma of the freezing garage, the memory of the hissing gas pipe, the sheer audacity of Richard trying to buy my permanent silence with a fraction of an inheritance triggered a violent panic response. I did not act like a calm, collected professional evaluating a contract. I grabbed the heavy parchment letter and ripped it cleanly in half right down the middle. I tore the release forms too, shredding the signature lines with shaking, furious hands. I hurled the pieces across my small kitchen, letting them flutter to the linoleum floor. I paced the room, my breathing shallow and fast, feeling physically sick at the thought of them trying to manipulate me again. I wanted to block the law firm's number and disappear entirely. But as the initial spike of adrenaline faded, my archival training kicked in. The panic receded, leaving behind a cold, clinical clarity. I had spent the last 3 years tracking complex historical property disputes. I knew how to hunt for missing assets. I knelt on the floor, gathered the torn pieces of the legal notice, and sat at my table meticulously taping them back together, aligning the torn edges perfectly. I needed the specific trust names and property parcel numbers listed in the fine print. The next morning, I went to work early. The Maritime Archive Museum had full digital access to the Massachusetts County Registry of Deeds database, a tool we use daily to verify historical land transfers. I sat at my preservation desk, fired up the terminal, and typed in Richard's name along with the parcel number listed on the taped-together letter. I bypassed the historical records and went straight to the active municipal property liens. What I found on the screen made the blood roar in my ears. There was no routine administrative restructuring. There was no minor family trust functioning normally. The reality was a massive hidden financial disaster. According to the municipal records, Richard and Diana were drowning in debt. Over the past 5 years, they had secretly taken out 2 massive illegal second mortgages on their primary residence, the split-level house where I grew up. The records showed consecutive missed payments and escalating municipal tax liens. The facade of the pristine coastal suburb life had completely crumbled. They were facing imminent, aggressive foreclosure. I cross-referenced the property records with the details of my grandfather's trust. The picture became terrifyingly clear. The trust held a highly valuable piece of undeveloped coastal property separate from their primary house. Richard desperately needed to liquidate that coastal property to pay off the crushing second mortgages and save his home from the bank. But there was a lethal catch written into the original deed of the trust. A clause that Richard, the municipal accountant, had somehow failed to override. The trust dictated that the property could not be sold, liquidated, or heavily leveraged until all surviving grandchildren reached the age of 25. Upon reaching that age, the asset could only be liquidated if every single named beneficiary signed a unanimous legal release. I had just turned 25 last month. I was the youngest grandchild. Richard and Diana were not offering me a generous early inheritance because they felt guilty. They were offering me a desperate $10,000 bribe, hoping I was too naive to understand that my signature was the only legal key capable of unlocking a multi-million-dollar property sale. They were trying to trick me into surrendering my leverage for pennies because without my signature, the bank was going to seize their home. I sat back in my desk chair, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my face. For 17 years, they had treated me as entirely worthless, an inconvenience banished to a freezing concrete floor. Now, through a bizarre twist of generational legal structuring, I held absolute total control over their financial survival. I printed the mortgage lien documents, the foreclosure notices, and the trust deed requirements, carefully sliding the warm papers into a manila folder. I did not call the Boston law firm back. I did not cash the check. I placed the folder in my desk drawer and waited. I knew exactly what would happen next. When their high-priced lawyers failed to secure my signature through a deceptive letter, the family would panic, and they would send the one person they thought could guilt me into signing. The golden child was about to step out of her comfortable bubble and track me down, but she had no idea what kind of trap she was walking into. The air inside the Maritime Archive vault was cool, heavily filtered, and smelling of dry, aging paper. I sat alone at my preservation desk, the manila folder containing my parents' foreclosure records resting near my keyboard. The initial rush of discovering their financial ruin had faded, leaving behind a persistent, nagging question that my trained archivist brain could not ignore. Why was the trust structured that way? My paternal grandfather, Arthur Gallagher, had passed away when I was 16, just 1 year before my exile to the garage became permanent. He was a quiet man, a retired coastal fisherman who rarely spoke during our tense holiday dinners, preferring to sit in the corner and observe. He had accumulated a decent portfolio of undeveloped coastal land over his lifetime, but he had always seemed entirely detached from Richard's obsession with neighborhood optics and municipal status. I turned back to my computer terminal, accessing the deepest levels of the Massachusetts County Registry of Deeds. I needed to see the original foundational paperwork for the generational trust, not just the recent lien activity. I typed in the specific trust identification number, running the query back a full decade to the year Arthur died. The screen populated with digitized scans of original land deeds and notarized legal pages. I started reading the dense boilerplate language, tracking the transfer of authority from Arthur to Richard as the primary trustee. It all seemed standard until I reached the final scanned document in the file. It was a codicil, an official legal amendment, attached to the main body of the trust, added just 3 months before Arthur passed away. I zoomed in on the scanned text, my eyes scanning the faded typewritten paragraphs. As I read the specific legal clauses, a profound, vindicating shock rippled through my entire body, making the hairs on my arms stand up. The trust was not just a random collection of coastal property, and the requirement for all grandchildren to sign a release upon turning 25 was not a standard bureaucratic hurdle. It was a highly specific, targeted legal weapon designed entirely around me. The codicil explicitly stripped Richard of his unilateral authority to liquidate the primary coastal asset. Furthermore, it established a voting structure among the surviving grandchildren. But the most staggering detail was buried in paragraph 4. Arthur had explicitly legally named me, Scarlett Gallagher, as the sole tie-breaking executor of the trust, taking full effect on my 25th birthday. If a dispute arose regarding the sale of the asset, my signature did not just count as one vote. My signature held absolute veto power over the entire transaction. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Why would a quiet, retired fisherman structure a multi-million-dollar family trust to give ultimate execution power to the youngest marginalized grandchild? A memory sharp and vivid broke through the fog of my hyper-vigilance. I was 15 years old. The garage was just beginning to become my permanent room. Arthur had visited the split-level house unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. He had walked past the kitchen looking for Richard and stepped into the garage. I remembered him standing there looking at the military cot, the concrete floor, the thin blankets. He had not said a word to me. But 10 minutes later, a violent, screaming argument erupted in the kitchen between Arthur and Richard. I had hid in the garage, terrified, listening to the heavy thud of fists hitting the granite counter. Arthur left the house, slamming the front door so hard the windows rattled. He never visited again. He died a year later. Arthur had seen the garage. He had seen the early stages of the abuse. He knew Richard was too cowardly to stand up to Diana, and he knew the trajectory of my exile was inevitable. He could not physically force them to bring me inside without triggering a massive domestic battle that might put me in worse danger. So Arthur did the only thing a pragmatic coastal fisherman could do. He played the long game. He went straight to his lawyer and secretly rewired the financial architecture of the family. He knew Richard would eventually mismanage his money trying to maintain his pristine suburban facade. Arthur built a legal trap designed to spring exactly when Richard was most vulnerable, arming the exiled daughter with the one thing Richard actually cared about: absolute financial control. Let me ask you something. Have you ever realized that someone who quietly watched from the sidelines, seemingly doing nothing to help, was actually silently arming you for a future war? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know if you have ever discovered a secret protector long after you thought you were completely alone. My imperfect moment took hold, overriding my basic physical needs. I became violently obsessed with the legal jargon on the screen. I spent the next 9 hours printing cross-referencing and highlighting every single clause of the codicil, mapping out exactly how Arthur had trapped my father. I did not leave my desk. I skipped lunch and dinner, ignoring the painful hunger cramps twisting my stomach. The thrill of discovering this hidden arsenal was intoxicating, blinding me to everything else. At 8 in the evening, my supervisor Brenda walked into the vault, jingling her keys. "Scarlett," she said, her voice echoing off the brick walls. "You have been down here since dawn. You need to wrap it up and lock the museum. The alarm system arms in 10 minutes. I did not look away from the screen. My eyes were burning dry and irritated. "I cannot leave right now." I snapped, my tone harsh and dismissive, totally disproportionate to her polite request. "I am in the middle of tracking a highly complex generational deed transfer. Just give me the override code for the alarm. I will lock up when I am done." Brenda stepped closer, looking at my manic expression and the messy piles of legal documents scattered across my preservation desk. "Scarlett, you look terrible. The documents will be here tomorrow. Shut the terminal down. That is not a request." I slammed my hands down on the metal desk, glaring at her. "I am doing actual real work here, Brenda. Just leave me alone and let me finish." The silence in the vault was immediate and heavy. I had just barked at the woman who had given me a stable job when I was a desperate runaway aging out of the system. My trauma response, the need to control the information and protect myself at all costs, had turned me into a hostile, erratic employee. Brenda did not yell back. She just looked at me with a mixture of concern and firm authority. "I am going to wait by the main entrance," she said quietly. "Pack your bag. You are going home." I closed my eyes, a wave of exhausted shame washing over me. I muttered a quiet apology, shutting down the terminal and gathering the printed codicil documents into my manila folder. I had the weapon I needed, but the sheer intensity of the discovery proved I was still operating in extreme survival mode. I walked out of the museum into the cold night air, clutching the folder tight against my chest. Arthur's incredible foresight had turned my parents' deceptive trap into an ironclad cage they had blindly locked themselves inside. They needed the trust money to stop the foreclosure, but they could not touch a single dollar without the sole tie-breaking executor signing the release. I knew they were running out of time. The bank deadlines listed in the municipal liens were closing in fast, and since their high-priced lawyers had failed to trick me with the red herring letter, they were going to have to change their tactics. They were going to send the one person they believed could manipulate my emotions. The golden child was about to leave her comfortable climate-controlled sanctuary and step directly into the archives, completely unaware that I held the keys to her survival. The heavy iron loading doors at the back of the Maritime Archive stood wide open to let the coastal breeze circulate through the preservation room. The scent of low tide and freezing brine mixed with the dry, papery smell of 19th century shipping manifests. I sat at my metal desk organizing the printed codicil documents into a neat, precise stack. The trap was set. I just had to wait for the first scout to wander into my territory. At 2 p.m, I heard the sharp clatter of heels striking the concrete floor. I did not look up immediately. I let the footsteps echo through the cavernous vault, bouncing off the exposed brick walls. When I finally raised my head, I saw my older sister standing in the main aisle. Harper was 29 years old. Growing up, she was the pristine centerpiece of our household. Her delicate health required climate-controlled bedrooms and endless parental subsidies. She never had to work a grueling minimum wage job or worry about keeping the heat running. But standing in the archive, she looked like a frayed, exposed wire. Her expensive beige trench coat was wrinkled at the hem. Her pale blonde hair lacked its usual careful styling, falling limp around her shoulders. She clutched a designer handbag tightly against her chest, like a flotation device. Her eyes darted nervously around the dim vault, taking in the peeling paint and the dust motes dancing in the narrow shafts of sunlight. Harper approached my desk, clearing her throat. She tried to arrange her features into an expression of casual, sisterly concern. It was a terrible, transparent performance. "Scarlett," she said, her voice tight and breathy, "it took me forever to find this place. You do not exactly make yourself easy to reach." I leaned back in my desk chair, resting my hands flat on the manila folder. "What do you want, Harper?" Harper crossed her arms, shivering slightly in the damp ocean air flowing from the loading dock. "Mom and Dad asked me to come talk to you. We know the law firm sent you a letter last week. They wanted to do something nice for you. The family trust has some liquid assets, and Dad thought it would be a good idea to cut you in. $10,000 is a lot of money for someone in your position. It could really help you out." The sheer audacity of her pitch was staggering. She stood there attempting to frame a desperate legal bribe as a charitable family donation. I looked at her manicured hands gripping her purse strap. I looked at the dark, exhausted circles under her pale blue eyes. She was drowning. The crippling lack of independence our parents had fostered in her was finally taking its toll. Without Richard and Diana writing checks to cover her rent, her car insurance, and her credit cards, Harper was suffocating under the brutal reality of the Massachusetts cost of living. Her chronic asthma was never her true downfall. Her profound, manufactured helplessness was a generous offer. I said, my tone flat and unreadable. "Why now?" After 5 years of dead silence, why do they suddenly want to cut me in on a family trust? Harper shifted her weight, avoiding my direct gaze. People change, Scarlett. Dad feels bad about how things ended. He wants to make things right. But you have to sign the release forms to get the disbursement. The lawyers need the paperwork finalized by Friday. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the thick stack of municipal property liens and foreclosure notices I had printed the previous day. I dropped them onto the metal desk. The papers landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "They do not feel bad, Harper?" I stated, picking up a red pen and tapping it against the top legal document. "They are broke. They took out 2 illegal second mortgages on the house. The bank is foreclosing. They are facing financial ruin, and they need to liquidate Grandfather Arthur's coastal property to cover the massive debt." Harper stared at the papers, the remaining color draining rapidly from her cheeks. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. And the best part, I continued leaning forward. Grandfather left a codicil. They cannot sell the land unless every grandchild signs off. And since I turned 25 last month, I am the sole tie-breaking executor. I hold the keys to the entire estate. That $10,000 check was not a gift. It was a cheap, insulting trick to make me surrender my leverage so you all do not end up on the street. Let me ask you a question. When the golden child who happily watched you freeze in a garage suddenly comes begging for a signature to save their own comfortable life, do you rescue them? Do you throw a life preserver to the sibling who let you drown in the reality you had to survive? Drop a comment and tell me if you would sign the paper or let the ship sink. Harper began to shake. Her composed facade collapsed, shattering into 100 desperate, transparent pieces. She dropped her designer handbag on the floor and gripped the edge of my metal desk. "Scarlett, please." Harper begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched nasal whine. "You have to sign it. You do not understand. If Dad loses the house, he cannot help me pay my rent. I am $50,000 in credit card debt. I will get evicted. My lungs cannot handle a cheap apartment with mold or winter drafts. I will end up in the hospital. You have to help us." I looked at her terrified face. She was utilizing the exact same medical excuse that had condemned me to 4 years on a concrete floor. She expected me to sacrifice my legal entitlement to protect her fragile respiratory system. The sheer entitlement of her request ignited a dark, twisted amusement deep in my chest. I did not offer her a wise, empathetic rejection. I did not take the moral high ground and explain the importance of boundaries. I looked right into her panicked, tear-filled eyes, and I laughed. It was a harsh, cruel, jagged sound. It echoed off the brick walls of the preservation vault, piercing through the quiet hum of the climate control system. It was the sound of 17 years of pent-up bitterness finally breaking free. I laughed right in her face, mocking her inability to pay her own rent, mocking her terror of living the exact rugged life she had watched me endure. Harper recoiled as if I had struck her. Her breathing hitched. Her chest began to heave in rapid, shallow gasps. She clutched her throat, her pale fingers digging into her collarbone. A severe panic attack was seizing her lungs. She rummaged frantically through her dropped purse, pulling out her prescription inhaler and pressing it to her lips. She inhaled the medication, her shoulders trembling uncontrollably. I stood up from my desk. I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not ask if she was okay. I walked past her struggling form and stepped out onto the open loading dock. The freezing, salty coastal breeze whipped off the Atlantic Ocean, hitting my face with refreshing clarity. I took a deep, long breath, pulling the cold, crisp air deep into my healthy lungs. I stood there breathing freely, while the golden child choked on the consequences of her own dependent existence. When Harper finally managed to steady her erratic breathing, she slumped against a stack of archival boxes, looking small and entirely broken. "They just want to talk to you, Scarlett," she whispered, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Dad said if I could not get you to sign the papers, I had to at least get you to meet with them. Please, just hear them out." I turned back to face her. The panic attack had stripped away any remaining leverage they thought they held. They were desperate, cornered animals, and I knew that negotiating with cornered animals required stepping into their territory. "Tell Richard and Diana I will meet them to discuss the trust," I said, my voice flat and cold. "But I am not doing it at some downtown law firm. If they want my signature, they are going to have to look me in the eye. Tell them I will meet them at the house tomorrow." Harper nodded weakly, grabbing her purse and stumbling out of the archive without another word. She had delivered her message and secured the meeting. But as I watched her retreat, I felt a heavy, nauseating knot form in my stomach. I had just agreed to return to the Cape Ann split-level house. I had just agreed to walk back into the physical epicenter of my trauma. The paperwork gave me all the power, but crossing that threshold was going to test whether the terrified teenage girl inside me was truly gone or just waiting in the dark. The route back to Cape Ann felt like driving backward through a dark tunnel of time. The highway traced the jagged, rocky coastline, where the gray Atlantic Ocean crashed relentlessly against granite boulders. The sky hung low and heavy, promising freezing rain before nightfall. My older rusted sedan hummed along the coastal pavement. The car heater blasted dry, hot air against my shins, but I could not stop shivering. The dread sitting in the pit of my stomach was a heavy, cold stone. I had agreed to meet Richard and Diana to discuss the generational trust. Harper had delivered my firm message, and Richard had called my phone from an unknown number later that same evening. He demanded we hold the meeting at the house instead of a neutral corporate law firm. He claimed he wanted a private family discussion away from billable hours and attorneys. I knew the real motive. He wanted home field advantage. He needed to sit in his domain where he still believed he held an inherent authority over me. I turned off the main coastal highway onto the familiar suburban streets. Muscle memory guided my hands on the steering wheel, navigating the specific twists and turns I used to walk when I was a high school student, trying to delay going back to the garage. The neighborhood had not changed much. The surrounding houses still featured pristine colonial facades, neatly trimmed winter hedges, and expensive vehicles parked in swept driveways. Then I turned the final corner and pulled my car up to the curb outside my childhood home. I put the vehicle in park and stared through the windshield. A sharp jolt of pure shock pierced through the thick layer of anxiety clouding my mind. The house was decaying. Growing up, Richard had obsessed over the exterior of this property. He treated the front lawn and the siding as a direct reflection of his personal municipal standing. He would force me to pull weeds by hand in the freezing rain and scrub the concrete walkways to ensure the neighbors had nothing negative to whisper about. He worshipped neighborhood optics. Now the property looked like a rotting tooth in a row of perfect smiles. The front lawn was a desolate patch of dead brown crabgrass, choking out whatever expensive landscaping used to exist. The white vinyl siding was streaked with creeping green algae and dark stains of coastal mildew. A long section of the aluminum gutter hung loose from the roofline, dripping stagnant, muddy water onto the fractured concrete walkway below. But my gaze was drawn inevitably to the side of the house, the garage. The heavy aluminum door that used to seal me inside the freezing concrete cell was literally falling apart. The metal tracks had warped, leaving a jagged, crooked gap along the bottom where the harsh winter wind could blow straight through. The weather stripping hung in brittle, useless shreds. The facade of middle-class stability had fractured right open, exposing the financial ruin, rotting the foundation from the inside out. Their crushing debt, their illegal second mortgages, their desperate need for cash had stripped away their ability to maintain the illusion of success. Let me ask you a question. When you return to the place that caused your deepest trauma and you find it falling apart, is there any real satisfaction in seeing your childhood prison decaying? Or does looking at the ruins just reopen old wounds you spent years trying to heal? Drop a comment and tell me if witnessing your abuser's downfall brings you peace or just brings back the pain. I thought holding the legal leverage would make me feel powerful. I had the printed grandfather codicil and the municipal foreclosure records sitting inside a thick manila folder resting on the passenger seat. I held the keys to their financial survival. I was the sole tie-breaking executor. I had the upper hand. But as I sat in the driver's seat looking at the sagging garage door, the physical reality of the space bypassed my rational adult brain. The biting wind outside rattled my car windows. A subtle scent of freezing salt spray and wet asphalt seeped through the heating vents. It smelled exactly like the freezing January morning Inspector Thomas Gallagher had walked into the garage and shined his flashlight on my shivering body. My imperfect moment crashed over me without a single warning. The heavy stone of dread in my stomach lurched upward. A sudden intense wave of nausea hit the back of my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the feeling down, but the somatic memory of the freezing concrete, the hissing gas pipe, the sheer terror of Diana's twisted survival lectures overrode my entire nervous system. I grabbed a wrinkled brown fast food bag from the passenger floorboard. I leaned over the center console and vomited. My chest heaved as my body intensely rejected the stress. I sat there in my rusted sedan, wiping my mouth with a paper napkin, trembling from head to toe. Tears of pure frustration burned the corners of my eyes. I was 25 years old. I was a respected senior maritime archivist holding the legal power to bankrupt the people who had tortured me. Yet sitting in front of this decaying split-level house, I was still the terrified, freezing 17-year-old girl begging for a warm blanket. Professional success had not cured me. Legal leverage had not erased the trauma. The damage was wired deep into my cells, and crossing this physical threshold was demanding a toll I was barely equipped to pay. I sat in the car for 10 agonizing minutes, focusing on the steady rhythm of my breathing. Inhale the dry heater air. Exhale the panic. I forced my heart rate to slow down, letting the ringing in my ears fade into the background hum of the running engine. I grabbed a plastic bottle of water from the cup holder and rinsed the sour taste from my mouth. I looked at the manila folder resting on the seat. The documents inside represented my only shield. I picked up the folder, gripping the thick cardstock, until my knuckles turned white. I turned off the ignition. The sudden silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the whistling coastal wind outside. I pushed the door open and stepped out onto the street. The coastal cold immediately bit through my wool coat, stinging my cheeks. I walked toward the driveway, my boots crunching against the loose gravel and cracked asphalt. With every step toward the front door, the urge to turn around and flee back to my safe harbor apartment screamed in my head. But running away had cost me my legal standing 8 years ago. Fleeing had created the bureaucratic nightmare that nearly derailed my college education. I was not going to run today. I reached the concrete steps leading to the front porch. The wooden railing was splintered, peeling layers of old white paint. I stood in front of the heavy front door, the same door I had pounded on when the gas pipe leaked, the same door Evelyn had escorted me through with my plastic trash bag of belongings. I did not ring the doorbell. I raised my fist and knocked 3 firm, deliberate times against the wood. The sound echoed hollowly inside the decaying house. I heard the muffled sound of footsteps approaching down the hallway. The brass deadbolt clicked loudly. The door swung open slowly, revealing the dark interior of the living room. It was time to face the architects of my misery, and the confrontation waiting for me inside was going to shatter whatever polite illusions my parents still clung to. The heavy wooden door swung backward, revealing my father. Richard stood in the dimly lit foyer, looking remarkably smaller than the imposing municipal accountant I remembered. His shoulders stooped beneath a faded cardigan. The tailored confidence that once dictated our family hierarchy had evaporated entirely, replaced by a palpable nervous energy. He did not offer a greeting. He did not attempt a hug. He simply stepped aside, allowing me to cross the threshold into the house that had haunted my nightmares. I walked past him, clutching the manila folder tightly against my chest. The air inside the house felt thick, stale, and uncomfortably warm. We entered the main living room. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, shutting out the gloomy coastal afternoon light. Diana sat on a floral armchair near the cold fireplace. She wore a dark turtleneck sweater, her posture rigidly straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked exactly the same as she did the day she defended her abuse to the DCF caseworker. The years had not softened the hard, traumatic lines etched around her mouth. "Sit down," Scarlet Diana said, her voice carrying that familiar gritty South Boston edge. "Let us get this over with." I sat on the edge of the large beige sofa directly across from her. Richard took a seat on a small wooden dining chair, positioning himself slightly outside the main circle of the conversation. He stared intently at the scuffed hardwood floor, sweating visibly, avoiding my gaze, just as he had done in the grocery store produce aisle. He was present physically, but entirely absent emotionally, leaving his wife to execute the manipulation. Diana reached down and pulled a sleek black leather portfolio from the side table. She unzipped it, extracting the thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy embossed paper. The release forms for my grandfather's trust. She placed a heavy silver fountain pen on top of the papers and slid the entire stack across the glass coffee table toward me. "Your sister said you were being difficult about the disbursement." Diana began, her tone shifting into a practiced, weary patience. She spoke to me as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum over a toy. "We are offering you $10,000, Scarlett. We are trying to bring you back into the fold to make things right." I looked at the legal documents resting on the glass. They still believed the red herring had worked. They still thought I was entirely oblivious to their imminent foreclosure and the codicil that gave me absolute veto power. "You are not offering me anything," I replied, my voice tight, managing to keep my hands steady on my lap. "You need my signature to liquidate the coastal property so the bank does not seize this house." Richard flinched violently, his head snapping up from the floorboards. The color drained rapidly from his face. Diana, however, did not flinch. She simply narrowed her eyes, processing the reality that I had uncovered their financial ruin. She smoothly pivoted instantly, abandoning the generous gift narrative and deploying the very tactic that had kept me trapped for years. "Fine," Diana snapped, leaning forward. "We are in a tight spot financially, but this is your family, Scarlett. Your sister is drowning in debt. Your father is facing bankruptcy. You owe us your help. We raised you. You raised me in a freezing concrete box," I shot back, my voice rising, the anger beginning to bubble hot in my throat. "You let me inhale toxic gas. You hid from the state. You threw me away." "It was not a punishment," Diana insisted, her voice rising to match mine, thick with genuine, terrifying conviction. "How many times do I have to explain this to you? The garage was a crucible. It was training. You were strong. Harper was weak. I was preparing you for a harsh world. Look at you now. You survived. You have a job. You are independent. I made you resilient. We are willing to forgive your runaway rebellion if you just sign the paper and act like a part of this family." Let me ask you something. How do you react when your abuser looks you dead in the eye and offers you their forgiveness for the massive trauma they inflicted on you? How do you respond when they claim the damage they caused is the reason for your success? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know how you would handle that profound level of toxic gaslighting. I stared at Diana, my chest heaving, struggling to pull air into my lungs. She truly believed her own narrative. She believed she had forged a warrior instead of breaking a child. And then my eyes drifted past her rigid posture and landed on the far end of the beige sofa I was sitting on. Draped elegantly over the armrest, neatly folded to display the intricate woven pattern, was a heavy, thick Pendleton wool blanket. The pristine fabric caught the dim light, illuminating the rich, deep colors. It was one of the exact same wool blankets I had found locked inside the plastic storage trunk in the freezing garage when I was 17. The blankets she had deliberately hidden from me to ensure the coastal winter dug deep into my bones. The visual proof of her absolute hypocrisy shattered the last remaining wall of my professional composure. My imperfect moment exploded. I did not deliver a calm, collected cinematic monologue dismantling her psychological defense. The raw, unpolished fury of the exiled teenager took complete control. I stammered, my voice cracking violently as a hot, jagged sob tore its way out of my throat. "You did not make me tough," I screamed, standing up so fast my knees knocked against the heavy glass coffee table, rattling the wood frame. "You just made me damaged." I grabbed the heavy silver fountain pen resting on top of the legal documents. I gripped it so tight the metal dug painfully into my palm. "You sat in here in the warmth decorating your stupid couch with the blankets that could have stopped me from freezing," I yelled, pointing the pen at the Pendleton wool. "You let me shiver on concrete because you were terrified of your own past. You used me to fix your dead sister." I hurled the heavy silver pen across the room with all the strength I had. The metal projectile flew past Diana's head and smashed violently into the drywall behind her, leaving a deep, jagged dent before clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor. Richard jumped up from his wooden chair, holding his hands out in a desperate panic, trying to mitigate the explosive confrontation. "Scarlett, please," he begged, his voice trembling, his face slick with sweat. "Keep your voice down. The neighbors will hear." I spun around to face him, stepping closer. "You coward," I spat the word, dripping with venom. "You let her do it because you did not want to argue. You ran away from me in a grocery store. Do not ever speak to me again." Diana stood up from her armchair, tears welling in her eyes. But they were not tears of remorse for my pain. They were tears of profound self-pity. She pressed her hands against her chest, her breathing ragged. I watched Mary turn blue. Diana cried, her voice breaking, losing the hardened Southie edge, sounding suddenly small and terrified. I watched my sister freeze to death in a drafty room. "I could not let that happen to you. I had to make you strong enough to survive the cold." "You do not understand the cold, Scarlett. I understand it better than anyone," I whispered, my throat burning raw and exhausted. "Because you made sure I lived in it." The confrontation was messy loud and entirely devoid of any clean, satisfying closure. Diana was sobbing quietly into her hands, trapped in a traumatic flashback of her own childhood. Richard stood helplessly in the corner, entirely unequipped to handle the emotional wreckage filling his living room. The perfect suburban facade was completely destroyed, replaced by the ugly, jagged truth of our broken history. I reached down and picked up my manila folder from the sofa. I had unleashed the fury, but I still had the legal leverage, and it was time to deploy the final devastating blow. The emotional argument would never penetrate their pathological defenses, but a catastrophic financial penalty would force them to understand exactly who held the power now. I pulled a stack of heavily researched municipal records from my folder, preparing to deliver an ultimatum that would permanently alter their lives. The sharp echo of the heavy silver pen hitting the drywall still hung in the stale living room air. Diana sat slumped in her floral armchair, wiping the tears of her own unresolved childhood trauma from her cheeks. Richard remained pressed against the wall near the hallway, hovering in a state of terrified paralysis, desperate for the conflict to simply vanish. I stood over the glass coffee table, my chest heaving, struggling to rein in the explosive adolescent fury that had just hijacked my body. I took a deep, jagged breath, forcing the oxygen deep into my lungs, attempting to summon the meticulous senior archivist back to the surface. I reached into the thick manila folder I had carried across the threshold. I did not pull out the standard release forms they wanted me to sign. Instead, I pulled out a separate stack of papers printed on standard white copy paper, heavily annotated with bright red highlighter ink. I dropped the stack onto the center of the glass table, directly over their sleek black leather portfolio. The papers hit the surface with a flat, definitive thud. "What is that?" Diana asked, her voice thick and raspy defensive instinct, returning quickly to mask her vulnerability. I looked directly at Richard, my eyes locking onto his pale, sweating face. "That is your municipal accounting history," Richard Furfur stated, my voice dropping into a cold, calculated monotone. "Those are the property deeds, the secondary lien notices, and the initial loan applications you filed 5 years ago when the town started hitting you with the code violation fines from the garage." Richard stiffened visibly. His eyes darted toward the stack of papers on the table, but he refused to step closer. "I work at the Maritime Archive." I continued, my tone devoid of any emotion, operating strictly on verified historical facts. "We have digital access to the Massachusetts County Registry of Deeds. When your high-priced Boston lawyers sent me that ridiculous red herring letter offering a generous $10,000 gift, I did not just read the waiver. I tracked the parcel numbers. I read the original trust codicil grandfather Arthur filed before he died. I know I am the sole tie-breaking executor. I know you literally cannot liquidate the coastal property without my signature." Diana scoffed, leaning forward, gripping the armrests of her chair. "We know you are the executor, Scarlett. That is why Harper asked you to sign the release. We are offering you a fair 25% cut of the sale. That is your legal quarter. It is more money than a museum clerk sees in a decade. Take the deal and stop being dramatic." "I am not taking 25%, I replied, keeping my gaze fixed squarely on my father. "And I am not doing this to be dramatic. I am doing this because Richard committed a felony." The room went dead silent. The heavy velvet curtains seemed to absorb all the sound, leaving only the rapid, panicked breathing of the man cornered against the wall. "Richard, you are a municipal accountant," I said, leaning over the coffee table, my voice sharp and precise. "You understand exactly how financial liability works. 5 years ago, when you needed cash to pay off your legal defense against DCF and the massive town fines, you took out a second mortgage on this house. But you did not stop there. The records show you also took out a high-interest commercial loan, and to secure that commercial loan, you illegally listed Grandfather Arthur's coastal property trust as collateral." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His face turned a sickly, ashen gray. "You forged documentation claiming you had unilateral authority to leverage the trust asset," I explained, pointing to the red highlighted section on the top page. "You deliberately hid the existence of the codicil from the commercial lender because you knew the bank would never approve the loan if they knew a minor grandchild held veto power over the asset. You committed mortgage fraud." Diana turned her head slowly, staring at her husband. "Richard, what is she talking about?" "You told me the commercial loan was secured against your pension." "He lied to you, Diana," I said, answering for him. "And now the debt has caught up. The commercial lender is threatening to call in the collateral which triggered the primary bank to initiate foreclosure on this house. You are bankrupt. And worse, Richard is a town employee who committed financial fraud. If the town board finds out, he will lose his pension entirely. If the lender presses charges, he will face a federal indictment. Let me ask you something. When you finally have the power to destroy the people who broke you, does ultimate satisfaction come from demanding basic fairness? Or does it come from forcing your abusers to pay a massive, exorbitant penalty for their sins? Drop your comment below and tell me if you would take the fair share or if you would take everything you could get." Richard took a slow, trembling step away from the wall. "Scarlett, please," he whispered, his voice cracking, brittle and pathetic. "You do not understand the pressure I was under. The legal fees were crushing us. I just needed a bridge loan to keep us afloat until the market improved. I was going to pay it back. I was protecting the family. You were protecting your neighborhood optics," I corrected him, my tone dropping to a whisper. "You let me inhale toxic gas to save a plumbing fee, and then you committed federal fraud to avoid paying a lawyer out of your own pocket. You are a coward." I reached into the folder one last time, pulling out a single sheet of paper I had typed up the previous night. I placed it gently on top of the municipal records. "I will sign the release to liquidate Grandfather's trust," I announced, standing up straight. "But I am not taking 25%. I am taking 40% of the total gross sale." Diana gasped, jumping up from her floral armchair. 40%? Are you insane? That leaves barely enough to cover the principal on the second mortgage. We will have absolutely nothing left over to secure a new house. We will lose the equity entirely. "That is exactly the point, Diana," I shot back, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "You will walk away with just enough cash to stop the bank from seizing this property and filing formal fraud charges against Richard. But you will have to sell this house to pay off the remaining debt. You will be forced to downsize drastically. And Harper is going to have to get a job to pay her own rent because your endless financial enabling is officially over." "You are extorting your own parents?" Richard croaked, clinging to the doorframe for support. "I am enforcing a penalty," I corrected him. "You have 48 hours to have your Boston lawyers draft the revised payout agreement listing my 40% share. If I do not receive the updated documents by Friday morning, I am taking these highlighted municipal records directly to the commercial lender and the town ethics board. I will personally hand them the proof of your fraud. And then I will let the state dismantle your life exactly the way they dismantled mine." My imperfect moment seized me the second I finished delivering the ultimatum. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, violently, trembling at my sides. A massive, crushing wave of guilt washed over me, fighting against the adrenaline. I was extorting my own father. I was using the same ruthless cutthroat tactics that they had used against me. My deeply ingrained psychological instinct, the terrified teenager programmed to shrink away and avoid conflict, screamed at me to apologize, to take the 25% and run. I felt physically sick, my stomach churning, twisting in knots. I had to clench my fists so tightly my fingernails dug half moons into my palms just to keep my arms still. I refused to let them see me waver. Richard, the man who had obsessively forced me to shovel the coastal snow to avoid the city plows, was now completely hopelessly trapped by the very municipal bureaucracy he had worshipped his entire life. The irony was heavy, thick, and undeniably poetic. He had nowhere to run. There were no grocery store aisles to hide in. He was cornered by his own cowardice. I did not wait for their response. I picked up my empty manila folder, turned my back on them, and walked out of the living room. I crossed the dark foyer, pulling the heavy wooden front door open and stepping out into the freezing coastal afternoon. The wind hit my face, biting and sharp, clearing the stale air from my lungs. I walked down the cracked asphalt driveway, leaving the decaying split-level house behind me. I had dropped the bomb. The 40% demand was non-negotiable, and the final legal execution of that demand was going to force my parents to experience the exact physical reality they had subjected me to for 4 years. The ultimate closing act was set, but the emotional toll of securing the victory was going to demand one last grueling confrontation in a sterile Boston boardroom. The conference room at Harrison and Vance Attorneys at Law sat on the 24th floor of a glass skyscraper in downtown Boston. The view overlooked the sprawling gray expanse of the harbor, a sharp contrast to the sterile mahogany table and the polished leather chairs filling the room. It was Friday morning, exactly 48 hours after I had dropped the fraud ultimatum in my parents' decaying living room. I sat at one end of the long table wearing a simple wool blazer, resting my hands flat on the polished wood. My posture was straight, calm, and clinical. Across the vast expanse of the table sat Richard and Diana. They looked devastated. The crushing weight of their financial reality had aged them overnight. Richard's tailored suit hung loosely on his shoulders, his face sallow, his eyes fixed firmly on the brass nameplate of the senior partner mediating the signing. Diana wore a dark, muted dress, her usual aggressive South Boston defiance replaced by a tight, pinched silence. They had spent 48 hours scrambling checking accounts, calling lenders and consulting lawyers, only to realize that every single escape route was permanently blocked. The senior partner, a tall man with silver hair and a meticulously neutral expression, slid a thick stack of finalized legal documents across the table toward me. "Miss Gallagher," he stated, his voice carrying the smooth, detached rhythm of corporate billing hours. "This is the revised disbursement agreement. As per the terms negotiated, your signature releases the trust asset for immediate liquidation. In exchange, 40% of the total gross sale will be wired directly to the account you provided. The remaining 60% will be transferred to Richard Gallagher as primary trustee to satisfy the outstanding commercial and residential liens." I picked up the heavy silver pen resting beside the documents. It was not a weapon to be thrown against a wall. It was the instrument of my permanent independence. I did not read the dense legalese again. I had already spent hours reviewing the digital drafts with my own retained counsel, confirming that the clauses offered zero loopholes for Richard to exploit. I flipped straight to the final signature page. The paper felt thick, expensive, and deeply satisfying. I pressed the nib to the line and signed my name in a smooth, dark arc. I slid the documents back across the table. The senior partner gathered the pages, his assistant quickly stamping the notary seal on the bottom corner. "The transaction is complete," he announced, closing the leather portfolio. "The funds will clear within 3 business days." Richard let out a long, trembling exhale, leaning heavily back into his leather chair. The immediate threat of federal fraud charges and the loss of his municipal pension was officially neutralized. He had avoided prison, but the cost of his cowardice was staggering. The poetic justice of the settlement was sharp, undeniable, and rooted entirely in the brutal reality of the Massachusetts housing market. They had 60% of the trust money, which was exactly enough to pay off the commercial lender and satisfy the primary bank to avoid a formal foreclosure mark on their credit. But to clear the remaining debt from the illegal second mortgages, they had no choice but to list the pristine split-level house for immediate sale. They were losing the property they had sacrificed me to protect. The manicured lawn, the expensive siding, the neighborhood optics, it was all gone. I knew from my archival research into their remaining assets that they could not afford to buy another house in a coastal suburb. They were forced to dramatically downsize, moving into a cheap, aging, and poorly insulated apartment complex on the industrial edge of town. They were going to spend their retirement years dealing with drafty single-pane windows, unreliable municipal heating, and the biting coastal wind pushing through the cracks in the walls. They were going to experience the exact physical cold they had forced me to endure. Harper, too, was forced to pack her expensive belongings and move out, taking a minimum-wage retail job just to cover her own rent in a cramped studio because the parental bank was permanently closed. Let me ask you a final question. When the war is over and you are the one left standing, does true closure come from actively destroying your enemies? Or does it simply come from building a wall so high they can never touch you again? Drop a comment below and tell me if walking away is a victory or a surrender. The meeting concluded. The senior partner stood shaking hands with Richard, offering hollow professional pleasantries. I gathered my coat and my bag, preparing to leave the skyscraper and return to my life. I walked out of the conference room, stepping into the brightly lit reception area, filled with busy paralegals and ringing phones. I headed toward the glass double doors leading to the elevator bank. Scarlet, wait. The voice was weak, gravelly, and desperate. I stopped, turning around slowly. Richard had followed me out of the conference room. He stood a few feet away, looking completely lost, stripped of his authority and his pride. Diana remained inside the room, refusing to witness his final capitulation. Richard took a hesitant step toward me. His eyes were wet, rimmed with red exhaustion. He looked like a man who finally understood the sheer magnitude of what he had thrown away to save a few dollars. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have protected you. I know that now." He reached out, lifting his arms in a weak, awkward motion, attempting to pull me into a hug. He was seeking comfort, seeking absolution, seeking a moment of paternal connection to soothe his crushing guilt. My imperfect moment struck, overriding my clinical detachment. The terrified, freezing 17-year-old girl living inside my cells rejected his touch with primal ferocity. I violently flinched, stepping backward so fast my heel caught on the carpet. I raised my hand and aggressively slapped his outstretched arm away. The sharp smack of skin hitting skin echoed loudly across the reception area. "Do not touch me!" I snapped, my voice harsh, jagged, and completely devoid of forgiveness. Several paralegals sitting at nearby desks stopped typing, looking up in startled silence. The professional atmosphere of the law firm fractured under the weight of the messy, raw, familial rejection. I did not care about the stares. I did not care about the optics. "You do not get to hug me, Richard," I said, my chest heaving, keeping my distance. "You do not get to pretend this is a sad movie where we hug and learn a lesson. You let me freeze. You let me inhale gas. You let me run away. You do not get to seek comfort from the daughter you abandoned." Richard pulled his arm back, holding it against his chest, as if I had burned him. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the carpeted floor. He accepted the rejection because he knew it was the only honest thing left between us. I turned my back on him, pushed through the heavy glass doors, and walked into the waiting elevator. The doors slid shut, severing my connection to the Gallagher family forever. There was no neat, happy ending. My family remained profoundly broken, but I was finally, permanently free. The wire transfer cleared my bank account on a Tuesday morning. I did not use the 40% share to buy a flashy sports car or a massive mansion to show off my new wealth. I used my archival skills to find exactly what I needed to heal. I purchased a small, beautifully renovated apartment on the top floor of a historic brick building overlooking the Cape Ann Harbor. I paid cash, securing the deed solely in my name. The building had been retrofitted with top-of-the-line, double-paned thermal windows, deep foam insulation in the walls, and a robust, modern HVAC system. It was a fortress against the Massachusetts winter. I also established a small legal defense fund, working with a local nonprofit designed specifically to help emancipated minors navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of federal financial aid dependency overrides, ensuring no runaway had to fight the system alone. Late that afternoon, I walked to the local train station. I boarded the commuter rail, heading back toward my new apartment on the coast. I sat by the window watching the familiar landscape blur past. The sky over the Atlantic Ocean was turning a deep bruised purple, signaling the arrival of a bitter, freezing winter storm. The coastal wind was picking up, whipping the ocean into white caps and driving sleet against the train glass. I sat back in my seat. I reached for the collar of my heavy, thick wool coat, pulling it tight around my neck. The fabric was soft, blocking out the draft from the train window. I looked out at the freezing ocean, the very water that had chilled the garage for 4 long years. A hollow, grounding peace settled deep into my chest. The terrified girl was still there, part of my history, part of my archives, but she was no longer in charge. The storm was raging outside, battering the coastline, but it could not reach me anymore. I took a deep, slow breath, pulling the warm, filtered air into my lungs. I am finally warm. I stand by the double-paned window of my harbor apartment, holding a ceramic mug of hot black coffee. Outside, the Massachusetts winter is doing what it always does, howling against the glass and tearing at the frozen docks below. But inside, the thermostat reads a steady 72 degrees. I do not wear a coat indoors anymore. The silence here is not the heavy, anxious quiet of that old split-level house. It is the steady, grounding quiet of safety. The trauma does not vanish overnight. There are still mornings I wake up with a racing heart, expecting to feel frost on a concrete floor, but those mornings are slowly fading. I built this piece brick by brick and document by document. Looking back at the frozen garage, the endless bureaucratic red tape, and that final sterile boardroom confrontation, I carry 5 distinct truths with me. I did not learn them in a classroom. I learned them surviving the cold. Lesson 1 is that abuse wrapped in the guise of protection is still abuse. A parent's traumatic past might explain their twisted actions, but it never excuses them. You do not owe your abusers your sanity just because they are fighting their own demons. Lesson 2 is that the quiet enabler inflicts the deepest wounds. The person who looks away to avoid discomfort, the one who runs down the grocery store aisle rather than face the truth, creates the exact environment where cruelty thrives. Cowardice is a weapon all its own. Lesson 3 is that the system will not save you just because you suffered. Bureaucracy runs on rigid paperwork, not pity. If you want to survive the grinding machinery of the real world, you have to become meticulous. You must take the hypervigilance born from your trauma and turn it into your sharpest operational tool. Lesson 4 is that forgiveness is a choice, not a mandatory requirement for healing. Society loves the narrative of the tearful family reunion, but rejecting a hollow apology and slapping away a toxic hug is a valid, necessary form of closure. You are allowed to walk away without granting absolution. Lesson 5 is that true justice is not about destroying your enemies. It is about rendering them irrelevant. I did not demand my share of the trust to ruin my parents. I took it to build a financial and emotional fortress so high they could never drag me back into the dark. If you are sitting in the cold right now waiting for someone to unlock the door, stop waiting. Start gathering your evidence, plan your route, and when the moment comes, step out into the freezing wind and build your own fire. Thank you for listening to my story here on Olivia Stories Revenge. If this journey resonated with you, if you have ever had to freeze toxic people out of your life just to keep yourself warm, please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Tell me which of the 5 lessons hit closest to home for you. Hit the like button, subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story about taking back control. Stay safe, stay sharp, and most importantly, stay warm.